And of course, they didn't listen to them. They just started throwing tear gas. And I think that's when all hell broke loose.
I don't know if you can hear any of that.
Yes,
Right.
Sounds like shots.
They launched, I don't know, about half a dozen or a dozen canisters of tear gas. There's smoke.
Ivan, from as much as you can see, are the warriors pulling back now?
Everybody was. I mean, we're moving cars, we're moving camps, we're moving people, reporters.
Are those shots, Ivan? Hello?
It was a bloody day at the Mohawk Indian community in Oka, Quebec, near Montreal. Provincial police in riot gear stormed the barricades the Mohawks had set up. There were clouds of tear gas, a hail of bullets, and in the midst of the battle of...
You're listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. On this episode, we're discussing Oka Everywhere, track 4 on the I'd Rather Be Flag Burning 10-inch split with I Spy. And the same version also appears on Where Quantity is Job Number 1, that compilation from G7. There's also an exclusive acoustic version of Oka Everywhere that appears on the Systematic Destruction 7-inch compilation, which also features Winnipeg bands like Malefaction and Silence Equals, and another track from I Spy. And the song also appears as track number 3 on the Teenage Kicks 10-inch compilation from Custodial Records. There are 1,900 copies of the Teenage Kicks compilation, and 300 of those come with a bonus 6-song 7-inch record. So if you're a vinyl person and you're into rarities, the version with the bonus 7-inch is even rarer.
Yeah. And, just as a quick reminder, if you want to know the story behind the I'd Rather Be Flag Burning 10-inch split, we have that episode number 44 with Todd Congealier of Recess Records that we put out a while back, where we really broke down the story behind each release that Propaganda did on Recess Records, including the Flag Burning 10-inch. And, if you want to hear another episode from the Flag Burning 10-inch, don't forget about episode number 28 about the song Woe Is Me with David Gillis, who was in Propaganda. And, Keith, this is an episode that is really challenging for me. And I know that you have been struggling as well, but the disclaimer that we have to use and say at the very beginning of this episode is something we've said so many times on the show, and that this is an issue that we could never do justice to, no matter how much we discuss it. This episode could be 30 hours long. You know what I mean? And I feel like it would never get to the root at the flashpoint moment known as the quote unquote Oka crisis that enveloped Canada in the summer of 1990. And this is something where this history is so immense, so long, so painful that hearing us discuss it on this episode, there's no way we could do this justice.
Right, Greg. I've been really obsessing over the things that I might miss in the timeline leading up to Oka, or in the 20 plus years since then of something else inspired by it, or the 30 years now, I realize.
Yeah.
Pronunciation to the correct terminology in the names used, all of those, despite my best intentions of trying to create an informative episode about the event and the legacies of the event, and then the song as well. Despite my best intentions, I'm going to miss stuff. I'm going to mispronounce things. I'm going to perhaps use an outdated term. So please, like before, share any updated information with us so we can add to this, because this is a starting point in the conversation, or a middle point in the conversation for us. We're hoping to still continue to learn about the Oka crisis and the train of history that involves land struggle and ignored land claims and indigenous sovereignty in the United States, but also in Canada.
Yeah. So I think that we should start by knocking out some terminology. So, Keith, what is Oka?
Right. So Oka is a town in Quebec across the Lake of the Two Mountains from Montreal, Quebec. And it's about 70 kilometers driving distance to downtown Montreal from Oka.
Nice. What about the crisis? What is this Oka crisis?
So the Oka crisis is a land rights movement that occurred in the summer of 1990 between the Mohawk people and the town of Oka's government and the Canadian government. And we will get into exactly what transpired in just a bit.
Nice. So the term Oka crisis as well, I'd like to throw a little wrench in the gears here and complicate this term a little bit because I've been learning so much about this recently. So there is a book that Arbeiter Ring Publishing, John K. Sampson's publishing company, put out a while back called This is an Honor Song, 20 Years Since the Blockades. And the editors of that book are Kira Ladner and Leanne Simpson, who are two Canadian professors who put together this book in collaboration with John K. Sampson. And they have this to say about names. And so the term Oka crisis is problematic in and of itself. So this is what Simpson and Ladner write in the introduction to their book. So, quote, although the Oka crisis is known to most Canadians as the Oka crisis, the term is offensive to many involved in the struggle because it refers to the non-native town and because the term was manufactured by the mainstream media. We agree. However, in editing a collection from a group of such diverse writers, we have left the language up to the individual writers. Like it or not, Indigenous or Canadian, people identify with the term Oka crisis in far greater ways than they do phrases such as the resistance at Kanasatake or the standoff at Kanasatake and Ganawake. So still, we feel it is important to disrupt colonial labels and have encouraged writers to decolonize their use of language where appropriate. So I thought that was really cool that they complicate the term. So even though we have Oka crisis as being like the main term that people associate with this event, and even though that is essentially what is happening in the name of this song, people who have studied this in the decades since this song was written and since these events transpired encourage us to complicate our own understanding of the name that is associated with this event. So as we go through this episode, anyone out there listening can consider how they feel regarding terminology themselves.
Right, Greg. I'm really glad that you brought this up because the name itself, not even the description of the events, the narratives, has a built-in settler bias. It's deemed a crisis when Indigenous resistors stand up for their land rights. And crisis isn't used, of course, to describe the centuries of genocide and displacement at the hands of settler nations. So I think being aware of those terms to update and to add to what we know about the song is super important.
Yeah. So, I've got some sources that I've been looking at the last couple of weeks in relation to this song. So in order to understand the lyrical content of the song, like we're going to go through a timeline of events of hundreds of years in the making that need to be examined. And this is really a challenging thing for us to do within the scope of this show. And there's no way that two guys from the United States Midwest can really go into this. So please defer to the immense amounts of credible and reliable firsthand accounts of these events as they transpired. So I'm thinking about the work of Ellen Gabriel, the story of Juanique Horn Miller, as well as that book I mentioned earlier from Kira Ladner and Leanne Simpson. This is an honor song, 20 years since the blockades. And, in addition to that book, some other cool sources are At the Wood's Edge, an anthology of the history of the people of Kanasatake by Brenda Gabriel and Arlette Kanawate Vandenhend from the Kanasatake Education Center in 1995. So that's another one. And interestingly, there is a translation of the book At the Wood's Edge that was translated into French by Francine Lemay, who is the sister of the SQ officer Marcel Lemay.
Oh, interesting.
Who is mentioned in the first line of the Propaganda song. So the SQ officer that Chris talks about in the first line of the lyrics, his name was Marcel LeMay, and his sister Francine LeMay has done French translations of the book At the Wood's Edge, which is a look back at the Oka crisis. So many things have happened since this book came out to have bridge building within some really interesting connections, which I'll get into. But the last suggestion that I have is People of the Pines, The Warriors and the Legacy of Oka by Jeffrey York and Laureen Pendera, which came out in 1991. So there's a lot of great sources that I was finding. Did you find anything that people should check out?
A few things that I recommend and that I leaned on heavily for my research and preparation for this are a few documentary films by Alanis Obamswin. Kanasatake, 270 Years of Resistance is really, really informative and a great starting point. Also Rocks at Whiskey Trench and Spud Wrench, Kanawake Man. Those documentaries, you can find all of those online. And a few podcasts as well. The Secret Life of Canada has a 2-part series on the Oka crisis. And the first episode is just the events of settler colonial history leading up to this event. And I also listened to an episode from Frontrunner podcast with an interview with the filmmaker Tracy Deer, who was present at during Oka. And she's a filmmaker who has recently directed a movie called Beans.
I saw the trailer.
It looks incredible, but I can't find it to rent or to buy online.
I don't think it's out yet. I think it's a brand new film.
Oh, so I saw that there were reviews up, but if it's just not had a widespread release yet. So it tells the story of Oka through the eyes of a 12-year-old girl. I mean, one of the things that stands out in the trailer, Greg, is the footage of or the scenes of 2 girls riding their bikes down highways that have been shut down. And that's one of the things that she talked about in that podcast interview. And then a few things from YouTube. I found from the Mohawk Council of Kanasatake's YouTube channel, they have a really informative video. It's called Brief History of the Lands, and it's created by the Kanasatake Grand Chief Serge Simon, in which, kind of like that first episode of Secret Life of Canada, it goes through the history of the events leading up to. And for me, as an American, as someone who's not well versed in Canadian history as a whole, and certainly not Indigenous history in Canada, it was really, really informative.
Well, I know that you also have an audio sample of a clip from Grand Chief Simon. So should we go ahead and let the audience hear a little bit from Grand Chief Simon right now?
Let's do it.
I think for us, the Oka crisis just ended not too long ago, because the social disintegration of my community is what followed after 90. It tore this community apart. Families were torn apart. Friendships lost. We lost a lot of young people since 90. I mean, must have been close to 20, almost one a year, through accidents, suicides, overdose. And we never saw that before 1990. We never saw that, ever. We rarely saw the SQ here. If we saw them once a month pass through our territory, it was amazing. And here they were now. They were all over the place, and then all of a sudden they're gone. Now the whole place is torn apart. I think maybe the lasting legacy of the Oka crisis is that we're taking just a little bit more seriously when it comes to our affairs. You know, the government doesn't want to see another Oka crisis. The surrounding area doesn't want to see another one. And we sure don't want to see another one. After what we've been through, not many people in this country could say they've been through what we've been through. So, the lasting legacy, I think that's still yet to be determined what that is. I just want to see my community do better, a lot better. You know, there's a lot of room. Like you can think, like I said to some of the chiefs, you can think of Kanasatake as a blank blackboard. There's nothing on it. You could do anything. pick a point and do something. Bring something in, start something. And that might grow into something else.
That was really cool. I'm really glad that you found that that little snip from Grand Chief Simon. That's really fantastic to hear directly of his voice, you know? And I also wanted to point everybody out to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And the website is trc.ca. And that's actually an organization in Winnipeg, which is really cool. And a couple more sources. Another one is Idle No More. So Idle No More started in November of 2012 among treaty people in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta who protest the Canadian government's dismantling environmental protection laws. So they're doing a lot of work about what is endangering First Nations who live on the land. And, you know, it's kind of meant for like organizing and popular education, and they're really prevalent on social media. So definitely check out idlenomore.ca as well. And, you know, Keith, this is a really, this has been an emotionally taxing process to prepare for this episode. And while we were preparing for it, we got the news that, you know, 215 child graves were essentially discovered with ground penetrating radar at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, which are believed to be undocumented deaths. And like, so that has been hugely on my mind all week as we've begun preparing this episode, as Canada essentially continues to deal with this, this legacy of settler colonialism in ways that, like, the United States really, in my view, hasn't even begun to scratch the surface on. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's like you have only so many puzzle pieces, and you know how some fit together. And then things like this come up into the news, Greg, and then you realize there are missing pieces of the puzzle that you just didn't even know about.
Yeah, and there are many that we can't even begin to find out. So
Right.
I think that we should go through a bit of a timeline of events leading up to the summer of 1990, so that people can have an understanding of the breadth and depth of this tremendously intense topic. And so just a little bit of background on the people who live there. So the Kanesatake is where we're talking about. And the Kanyenkeha, or the people of the Flint, or known today as the Mohawk, is one of 6 nations in a confederacy called the Haudenosaunee. And so that is, you know, just a little bit about the background there.
Yeah, so there are a few different theories as to the origin of the first use of Mohawk. And it includes the term being used by the enemies of the, you said Kanyenkeha. I also heard in the documentary Kanyukahaga, so I'm not sure about correct pronunciation. So just bear with us. So one theory is that that like the term Mohawk was originally meant something like man-eater or killer, in reference to like how revered the Mohawk were as warriors. And another dictates that neighboring Mohicans referred to the Mohawk people as the Mau-Unklin, meaning the Bear Place people. And later the Dutch transformed the name, hearing it and writing it, kind of, you know, simplifying it into a different language as Mohawk.
Interesting. Well, I want to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement here, because the Mohawk are actually relevant to where I live here in Buffalo. So this Haudenosaunee Confederacy is all over where I live. And, you know, I'd like to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Seneca Nation. It is on their land where I'm currently situated and where the majority of the work for this podcast takes place. So the Seneca, along with the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Tuscarora, make up the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the world's oldest continuous democracy, actually, which is really fascinating. And so this episode isn't specifically about where I live, but it's not that far off, because if I get in my car and drove to Oka, it would take me 6 hours to get there from Buffalo. It's really not far away at all.
Yeah, and I acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to my region and the different towns that I've lived in here, including Highland, which is built on the unceded indigenous homelands and resources. And I recognize the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people as past, present and future caretakers of this land. And if you're unable to answer the question, whose land am I on? You can explore a really great interactive map from native-land.ca, or if you just Google whose land am I on. And with that, the Native Governance Center has really useful tips for developing land acknowledgements, which you can find at nativegov.org.
Awesome. Well, so the Haudenosaunee, also known as the people of the Longhouse or the Iroquois, it's this confederacy of 6 nations that joined together under a dominant foundation, like known as the Great Law of Peace. So the Kanyen'keha or the Mohawk occupy the land in southern Quebec long before the arrival of Europeans, and Kanasatake came to exist in around 1721. And the Kanyen'keha were forced to move to Montreal, to its north, forced to move from Montreal to its north shore near the Lake of Two Mountains, which we mentioned earlier. And so the archaeological evidence, like pottery artifacts and like oral histories, attest to that territory serving as the traditional grounds long before 1721.
Yeah, and you mentioned where you live in Buffalo, Greg. So the Mohawks' role in the Haudenosaunee is as the keepers of the Eastern Door, as the easternmost nation in the Confederacy in parts of New York, Quebec, and Ontario. And then because of that, think of how much, and in many ways, much more contact they would have had with settler colonials in the 15, 16, and 1700s.
Yeah, well, and I have an absurd amount of dates in a timeline because to understand a flashpoint moment like Oka, which is a long and unsolved conflict that simmers until it boils, it's really important to look at timeline because flashpoint moments like Oka and the resistance don't just happen from nothing.
Right.
It simmers for a long, long time. And this stuff goes back to like 1676, man. So there's a seminary called Saint Sulpice, which is a Roman Catholic order from Paris. And they established a mission on Mount Royal near Montreal. And its objectives and obligations included evangelizing the indigenous people. So we have going back all the way to 1676 on this thing.
Yeah, and in addition to converting people to Catholicism, these priests also essentially become feudal landlords.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And then we jump forward to 1717, and King Louis XV orders the seminary to move its mission, and it granted them 9 square miles of land near the Lake of Two Mountains on the north shore of Montreal.
Just an important note that King Louis XV was 6 at the time, and ruling as his regent was his cousin, Philip II, who is the Duke of Orleans.
See, I didn't even know that, man. Like a 6-year-old king, like, that's so crazy whenever you think about the fates of entire populations of people like the Mohawk, and you think about who was king at the time, and that just blows the whole thing out of the water. So then in 1721, the mission moved to the Lake of Two Mountains, and then they joined the Mohawk already living in Kanasatake. So there were 2 small villages that were built by the seminary, one for the Mohawk. And although the mission was supposed to hold the land, which is about 7 times the size of Central Park, so in trust for the tribe, the seminary expanded this agreement to grant itself sole ownership rights. And then the Sulpicians began to sell cleared land to white settlers at huge profit, and non-indigenous settlers began to arrive in Kanasatake in about 1721.
So at first, this trust had a stipulation that the land would be returned to the King of France if the Mohawks left. And given the waves of intruding settlers and forced relocation by the Sulpician priests, who promised no more encroachment if the Mohawks settle in Kanasatake, like this is obviously kind of problematic. So according to oral tradition, the moving from Montreal to Kanasatake was marked by creating the 2-dog wampum belt, which is a record of their rights to the land, but also a contract that they would not have to move again. But of course, just having a cursory knowledge of history, violation of the contract happens almost immediately.
As usual.
Because the priests are selling timber and land for profit. The chiefs reminded colonial officials of the message it contained in the years after. And I found this quote. It says, "You see this white line which shows the length of our land." And this is describing the two dog wampum belt. "The figures with hands clasped who rejoin the cross represents the loyalty which we owe to the faith that we hold. The body represents the council fire of our village. The two dogs at the outside are supposed to guard the boundaries of our land. And if anyone attempted to interrupt our possession, it is their duty to warn us by barking." So this reminds me, Greg, of a letter that I read from Andrew Jackson with my students. Jackson sent an army officer to the Cherokee and the Choctaw with a message that remaining in their present territory, Howardson writes, they would have to abide by state laws which destroyed their tribal and personal rights and made them subject to endless harassment and invasion by white settlers coveting their land. So Jackson famously promised in the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, just without the panhandle, there beyond the limits of any state, in possession of land of their own, which they shall possess as long as grass grows or water runs. I am and will protect them and be their friend and father. So this is just a false promise of independence and never again, a thread that runs across our national borders between the United States and Canada when we learn of the treatment of indigenous populations.
Yeah, I mean, and then we like jump forward a little bit even more in our story here, and we have that in 1763, France loses control of all of its land in Canada at the end of the 7 Years' War to Great Britain. And Americans know the fighting in North America as the French and Indian War. So we have a little bit of power transference in 1763.
Yep, the Mohawks were told to pledge fealty to King George III. So the Mohawks appealed to the seminary in France, who then transfers the land title of Kanesatake to the seminary in Montreal, who then swears allegiance to Britain, and that all maintains the Sulpician priest control of the land. And if you look at these trends throughout settler colonial history in Canada and the United States, you see indigenous people working within the system to resist. And you know, that's like something else that we learned in my class, Worcester versus Georgia, with the Supreme Court ruling that the states did not have the right to impose regulations on Native American land, and setting up the foundation for the principle of tribal sovereignty. But it didn't actually protect the Cherokee or other nations from being removed from their ancestral homeland in Georgia, because Andrew Jackson just straight up ignored the Supreme Court.
Oh my gosh. It's just like one disappointment after another, which is why we're talking about all these events, because flashpoint moments like Oka don't just happen out of nothing. It's oftentimes centuries or decades or whatever of disappointments and lies that eventually just boil over. So in 1851, the people of Kanesatake protested their treatment at the hands of the seminary to the British civil authority, and they demanded the civil authority of an Indian agent replace the seminary's authority. And the demands are ignored, and this leads to a strenuous relationship right away.
So despite being relocated around Montreal, and then finally to Kanesatake, where they're told they will never be bothered again, this marked by the two-dog wampum belt, the priests who were previously selling their land tell the Mohawk to vacate the land if they're unhappy with the Sulpician authority. So some Mohawk leave to new reserves, which were set up by the British. Others remain behind. And if they protest the selling of the land by the priests, then they're forced out of Kanesatake.
Ugh, yeah. So what else happens in 1860? I know there's some other crazy stuff going on here too.
So I read about Joseph Ansakara, a young Mohawk who went into the seminary, and the priests believe that they could kind of make him into an ally.
Mm.
And he studied in Montreal, where he was actually a classmate with Louis Riel.
Oh, nice.
And later, after becoming the secretary of the Sulpicians in Kanasatake, he discovered these documents that confirm the Mohawks' title to the land. So he abandons that position. He becomes the chief and writes a letter to the governor detailing the disparities between the wealthy priests and the Mohawk who are kept poor. And he convinces a large number of First Nations to leave the Catholic Church. So Joseph Ansakara, also known as Chief Swan, he also challenged their authority over the land by cutting down a large elm tree without the priest's permission and demanded that the Sulpicians leave Oka within 8 days. He gave them an ultimatum. He was arrested, and as punishment, the Sulpicians gave away more than 1,000 acres of Mohawk land to Trappist monks.
Oh my gosh. And, then in 1868, the Sulpicians changed the place name of Kanasatake to Oka. So that is a significant point in naming. And Oka is another term for fish pickerel, apparently, is a translation I found. And the Canadian government refused the Mohawk position that the original grant was meant to set aside land for them or to compensate them for the loss of this territory. So it's like, oh, hey, we settled this stuff, but hey, just joking, psych. And then so in 1881, the government of Canada acquired land in Gibson, Ontario, and they forced the Mohawk people of Oka to move, and only a third of the Mohawk agree to move. Jumping forward to 1886, we have something really important, which is the birth of the area known as the Pines. And the Pines are going to come up a lot in the conflict itself. So after sand avalanches submerged the village of Oka in over a meter of sand, groups of people comprised of Mohawk and non-Indigenous settlers planted a bunch of pine trees on the mountains to stabilize the ground. And somewhere between 70 and 80,000 pine trees are planted.
Wow.
I know. And then in 1910, the Canadian Supreme Court maintains the St. Sulpice Order has title to the land, and Kanasatake has been defined as an interim land base by the federal government, unlike the reserves which come under the 20th Century Indian Act. And then a protest breaks out a year later about a proposed railway through the territory. And then in the 1920s, the Canadian government installed the elected band council system under the Indian Act, but doesn't recognize Kanasatake as either Indian territory or as a reserve. And then in the 1950s, the government of Canada purchased land owned by the Sulpicians and lived on by the Mohawks. So the sale does not resolve the issue of ownership of the Pines. So it's just a constant back and forth of just like disrespect and disregard for the people who are caretakers of this land. And it's just one slap in the face after another. And the Canadian government in the 1950s limited the Mohawk people to about 6 kilometers down from the previous 165 kilometers. So there's this massive reduction in the available land space. And then in 1959, the municipality of Oka rented out parts of the Pines to the Club de Golf Oka. A 9-hole golf course is built in the Pines without Mohawk consent. So that is like a huge piece of this story. And then in 1970, there's the creation of something called the Mohawk Warrior Society. And their objective is to repossess and protect Kanyenkeha territory according to the Great Law of Peace. And then we get into the 70s, and the Mohawk people present a joint comprehensive land claim, which asserts title to the land along the St. Lawrence River, the Ottawa River, the Lake of Two Mountains. But predictably, the claim is rejected on the basis that the Mohawk had not possessed the land continuously since time immemorial, and that any First Nations title had been extinguished. So just another slap in the face, man. And that just sucks.
And what a Eurocentric idea applied to First Nations. I mean, in this region, they had settled and farmed and moved in accordance to maintaining the health and resources of the land. So the idea of settling in one specific spot permanently is far more European, and that didn't work in North America. And because of that, they lose the title and the connection to the land.
Yeah, and then in the 70s, the Kanasatake Band filed another official land claim with the Federal Office of Native Claims regarding land, which includes the Pines or the Commons. and the claim is accepted for filing and funds are provided for additional research to the claim itself. But 9 years later, the claim is rejected on the grounds of failing to meet legal criteria. So there's like this 9 years of limbo.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, denied. And so in the 80s, the Oka Golf Club renewed its lease for 35 more years. And then in 89, a year after signing a 35-year lease extension, Oka announces the plans to expand the golf club into an 18-hole golf course, which includes building a condominium complex. And the proposed extension is to be built over Kanasatake cemeteries and the Pines, and the Kanasatake were not consulted in this. And then in 89, Grand Chief Clarence Simon demands that the project be stopped. And then in July of 89, several provincial and federal government representatives asked the municipality of Oka to reconsider the development plans. And the mayor of Oka agrees to a moratorium. But then in January of 1990, in the middle of the winter, Grand Chief Simon is dismissed and the clan mothers replaced him with George Martin. So as spring rolls around in March of 1990, the mayor of Oka puts an end to the moratorium and gives the go-ahead for the golf course expansion. And that is when the barricade on the dirt road leading to the disputed land is put up by Kanasatake. And then in April 26th of 1990, the municipality is granted an injunction by the court, and members of the Kanasatake community occupying the dirt road are ordered to remove the barricades. And so as you can just see, it's just ticking upwards, it's ramping up the whole time. It's just like one-upsmanship back and forth, back and forth. And so in May of 1990, the people of the Pines refused to dismantle the barricade. The Warrior Society joined the people of Kanasatake, and the barricade is actually reinforced more. And then on June 29th, 1990, the provincial mayor grants the mayor of Oka a second injunction. And then on July 11th, 1990, that is when a sort of like invasion happens, and Marcel Lemay, the SQ officer, is killed in a botched raid to remove these barricades. And so it's just ramping up as the summer goes along. And then in late July of 1990, several First Nation communities across Canada set up their own blockades to organize their own protests in support of the Mohawk. In British Columbia, there were several railways and roads that are blocked. And there is the Mercier Bridge into Montreal is blockaded. And this is when things start to get really wild. So in August of 1990, 10,000 people took to the streets of Kanawaka's neighboring town to demand the barricades be taken down, to demand the Mercier Bridge barricades be taken down. And an effigy of a Mohawk warrior is hanged and burned, these events reoccur several nights in a row. Mm-hmm. And then so it's ramping up. So on August 8th of 1990, the premier of Quebec asked the prime minister for military intervention. And then August 12th, the federal Indian Affairs minister, Tom Sidden, a Quebec Native Affairs minister, and the Mohawk negotiators signed an agreement guaranteeing access to food, medical supplies, and legal advisors. And then August 14th, deployment of the Canadian Armed Forces around Montreal happens. And the Quebec premier gives the Canadian military the order to take over Quebec's blockades. And then on August 20th of 1990, 4,000 soldiers with more than 1,000 vehicles, tanks, helicopters, trucks, artillery pieces, and other equipment are in place around Kanasatake and Kanawake, and close to 1,000 soldiers replace the provincial police and surround the Mohawk barricades, and Mohawk negotiators suspended further negotiations. I mean, it's like just one-upsmanship over and over.
So you said 4,000 soldiers. For reference, Greg, about 5,100 Canadian military personnel served in the Persian Gulf War.
Wow.
With a peak of 2,700 in the region at any given time.
Wow.
And the military historian Timothy C. Weingard writes that Oka was so big, it used up the entire national stockpile of barbed wire.
Oh my God.
And from what I could tell, it was the largest domestic military operation in Canadian history.
Oh my gosh. Well, a day later, negotiations with Kanasatake reopen. The Mohawks are seeking recognition of their sovereignty, their no arrests, and long-term negotiations that will grant them title over the territory. So this goes on for a week. Then the Canadian government announces it is going to proceed with the dismantling of the barricades. And then August 28th, civil protection authorities instruct all remaining citizens in Oka to evacuate, fearing an imminent invasion of the community by Canadian troops. And the people of Kanawake evacuate their children, women, and elders. And a convoy of 75 cars leaving Kanawake and crossing the Mercier Bridge into Montreal are greeted by mobs of angry white Canadians throwing rocks at passing vehicles, and several people were injured.
And this is detailed in the documentary I mentioned earlier, Rocks at Whiskey Trench.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And I also found an essay by the Montreal Gazette journalist Michael Orsini in the book This Is an Honor Song. So Michael Orsini said that August 28th was, for him, the defining moment in the Oka saga. And he writes in the book, let me find it here, quote, "The incident involved a crowd of angry residents of the neighboring town who had assembled on the Mercier Bridge to confront the Mohawk families who were being escorted off the reserve by cars for their own safety. Cars were filled with frightened children, staring out at the small crowd, shouting obscenities as their cars sped by. Then came the rocks. I was standing a short distance from the crowd with my notebook and pen, jotting everything down that I could and doing what had been drummed into me in journalism school. Capture the mood, get the local flavor for the reader who cannot be there to witness the event and must rely on your portrait of the event." So what was the mood like? Harrowing. Distancing myself was a way to separate myself from this ugly expression of violence by white people like me. I recall a man in his 50s, beads of sweat streaming down the side of his face, ambling toward a small hill to collect some rocks suitably big enough to smash a few windshields. Each time a rock was met with the sound of broken glass, a small group watching the sidelines cheered.
Oh, God.
So that is a direct account of the Montreal Gazette journalist Michael Orsini. And it's a really good depiction of his perspective of the event. 20 years later, he wrote that reflection. So we have a few more events here. So on August 29th, the Mohawk and Kanawake negotiate a deal that leads to the reopening of the bridge. On August 30th, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy leaves the negotiating table. On September 1st, the army advanced on the Mohawk barricades around Kanasatake, and there are only around 40 warriors left and almost as many women, children, and reporters. So as the military troops advanced, the warriors retreated, and there is a picture on that day that Shani Komulainen, a photographer, took of a Mohawk warrior facing a Canadian soldier.
Oh,
and
yeah,
that snapshot became one of the most recognizable images of the Oka crisis. And then on September 2nd, an army bulldozer dismantled the main Mohawk barricade. On September 18th, the Surete du Quebec, backed by the Canadian Armed Forces, raided Kanawake and seized weapons. And the altercation between the police, soldiers, and the Mohawk people left almost 100 people injured, which were mostly civilians. So it got messy. And then September 26th, the Oka crisis officially sort of ends at 4 p.m. The warriors burned documents and weapons. There was a spiritual leader's performance of a ceremony. The warrior flag flowing over the treatment center is lowered. A group of people of men, warriors, women, and children walked toward the military lines, and the surrender quickly turned to chaos as some people were like running through the woods and stuff, and the confrontation escalated, and like there was a physical altercation of the soldiers. And during the chaos, a 14-year-old named Wanique Horn Miller is accidentally stabbed in the chest. I'm not I mean, it says accidentally in the reports that I'm finding.
Right.
But she got stabbed, and that clearly did not have to happen. And when she got stabbed, she was holding her 4-year-old sister, Kanyetio Horn, who is known popularly in the world as Tio Horn, who is an actress and an actor in the TV show Letterkenny. And so, she survived, Hornmiller survived. And then the army brought the scene under control, and they arrested tons of Mohawk with plastic handcuffs. 5 warriors are handed over to the SQ for arrest, and the rest are loaded onto military buses. But countless interviews elaborate on this event with Wanik and Tio Horn. Kanyetio Horn said that in the distance past the soldiers, there was this metal bar on the ground with all these spikes sticking out of it. Maybe 20 feet behind that were all these people in normal clothes, not wearing camouflage. So in my 4-year-old mind, I was like, well, these people don't seem threatening. Let's go that way, right? So her sister, Wanik Hornmiller, said she just looked around at this violence breaking out around her, and she started to make this sound that will forever haunt me. Now, as a mother, I can tell you that I know every sound a child makes, whether they're hungry or tired or scared or hurt. There's different cries, and we know what that is. But there's a very special one they make when they think they're going to die.
Oh, God.
So Hornmiller is carrying her 4-year-old sister who was making this sound. And Hornmiller ran and made it to the media barricade. And when she got there, she recognized a soldier who had refused to allow her grade 10 school books past the blockade a couple weeks earlier. And she pointed at him and said, "I know you." As I pointed at him, I pulled my little sister behind my back. And right at that point, I got hit in the chest and I fell forward. And then someone kicked my feet out from underneath me. And I landed on my back, and my little sister fell on top of me. And then she said, I felt like my head was going to explode. I was so angry and scared. I was in terror. I had lost it. And I felt like my head was, I was in terror. And then Tio Horn said, all of a sudden I got jerked backwards. And that's, I guess, as soon as she got stabbed. I remember falling to the ground on my back and then her rolling over and taking me into an embrace. I just wanted my mom. So there was just so surreal, so many preventable and unnecessary moments throughout all of this. And, on September 29th of 1990, the last 300 soldiers of the Canadian Armed Forces retreated. So that's the timeline of events, which this propaganda song is based on, and the importance of this event upon Canadians across the country watching this on television every day in the summer of 1990 is profound. And it was like this kind of seismic shift in social consciousness around land rights issues, it seems. And there's a couple of propaganda connections too. So Wab Canoe, who did the spoken word piece on Things I Like, he has a chapter in This Is an Honor Song about the summer of 1990. And he said that it's the summer we stopped playing cowboys and Indians and started being warriors. And he said that when we started to see images of the warriors in the pines standing up for our people and our land, we were inspired to emulate them. Not only was this a watershed moment in our lives as we became politicized for the first time, it was also the start of a much larger shift. It was the moment in which struggle for Native rights became ingrained into the fabric of Anishinaabe society for my generation. So that's cool that Wab Canoe, who's friends with propaganda, did that spoken word on Things I Like, has a chapter in this book where he writes about the importance of this moment for himself. And fabulously, another past guest of ours on the show, Wabgishig Rice, also is in this book that I've been reading the last couple weeks. And he and Wab's chapters sit side by side in the book. And Wab Rice called in and left a message for us saying what the Oka crisis meant to him as a young fella. So let's hear Wab Rice's voicemail, and we'll be right back.
Ani Wabgishik Indijnakas, Makwat Nodem, Wasaksing Don Jaba. Hi, I am Wabgishik Rice. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabeg of Wasaksing First Nation on Georgian Bay, and I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario. I contributed the personal essay Dust to the anthology This Is an Honor Song, and that was inspired by one of my first protest experiences when I was a kid. In our community, there was a rail crew that was unlawfully taking sand and gravel from a quarry in our community. And after many years of this happening, our community stood up and decided they'd had enough. And I was just a kid, and our parents took me and my brother up there to sort of march around the heavy machinery, like the bulldozers and dump trucks, to stop them from stealing from our land any longer. Ultimately, it worked. The trucks all left, and they never came back. And that was the time that I had really witnessed our community make a firm connection with the land and, learn about that traditional bond and how it empowers us as Nishnabek, as Indigenous people. And it was really a life-affirming moment for me. And throughout the rest of my childhood, I saw other such moments, particularly the resistance at Oka. And I saw how that really unified Indigenous nations right across Turtle Island. And it became clear to me after Oka just how important that bond with the land is and how important that solidarity amongst Indigenous nations really is in terms of fortifying our knowledge of our history and our place on this land and our sovereignty on this land at the same time. So that personal essay, Dust, I eventually adapted it into short fiction, and it turned up in my first collection of short stories called Midnight Sweat Lodge, which was published in 2011. So that moment was very formative for me, and it was solidified by the resistance at Oka. And all these decades later, I honor the uprising at Oka. I acknowledge the sacrifices made by the Mohawks there, and I honor and respect them all the same. And I am thankful to have had this connection. And going forward, this history is really what's going to empower future generations to uphold their relationship with the land and to really certify their own people's connection with the land and how our relationship as Indigenous people with settlers can be, fortified at the same time too, by acknowledging that shared responsibility to the land. So, yeah, that moment at Oka was very influential, very informative for me. And looking back, I give thanks for that lesson that I learned and for the sacrifice made by the people there to ensure that future generations of Indigenous people can go forward on this land in sovereignty and with pride. So, Chimigwech to the traditional stewards of the land there, the Mohawks, and as an Anishinaabe, I honor you and I thank you. Chimigwech.
So thank you for that call in from Wob. Great to have your voice back on the show, my friend. So Keith, that's my timeline of events. And it's so, like I said at the very beginning of this episode, it's so impossible to get into flashpoint moments like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. You have to look at it in the greater context. And Greg, I've learned so much already from the things that I found, but also to the timeline that you shared. And we're also lucky enough to have some guests to share even more information and insight. So tell us about our guests for Oka Everywhere.
So our first guest is Robbie Richardson. Robbie Richardson is an English professor at Princeton University, and he specializes in 18th century British and transatlantic literature and culture. Robbie got a PhD in English and Cultural Studies from McMaster University, and he's spent the last 7 years or so living in London, teaching at the University of Kent and Canterbury and Paris. That informed his interdisciplinary research on looking at the interactions between Indigenous and European cultures. And he's interested in Indigenous studies, art, and material culture. And he's also a member of Pabineau First Nation, which is a Mi'kmaq community in New Brunswick, Canada. And Robbie has a book out called The Savage and Modern Self, North American Indians in 18th Century British Literature and Culture, which came out from the University of Toronto Press in 2018, in which he examined the representations of North American Indians in novels, poetry, captivity narratives, plays, and material culture from 18th century Britain. So Robbie is a super fascinating fella. And on top of all of that, Robbie played drums in Giant Sons with Beeve. So Robbie is the drummer on the original version of Tertium Non Datur, which is super awesome. And if you remember our conversation with Beeve in the Cut into the Earth episode, he consistently referred to his friend Robbie in very glowing terms.
Yeah.
This is that Robbie.
How cool.
So this was a real treat to chat with Robbie Richardson about his love of Propaganda and his take on the song Oka Everywhere. So please enjoy my chat with Robbie Richardson from Giant Sons and Princeton University. Professor Robbie Richardson, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so delighted to have you here, Robbie. Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to our audience so they know who you are and what you do?
Well, my name is Robbie, as you said, and I'm an English professor, but I'm also a musician. And, well, would be, I suppose. But
yeah.
But I used to play in bands with Beeve from Propaganda for a pretty long time. So awesome. I guess that's my connection to the extended universe here that you're building.
I love it. Well, let's talk a little bit about Beeve and your friendship with him. Tell me about your history of meeting Beeve and beginning to play music with him. Tell us a little bit about that backstory, because he mentioned you a lot in his other interviews that he's done on the show.
Yeah. Well, we started playing music together when we were pretty young, like I think about probably 13, 14. And initially I was a guitarist actually. And so we both would sort of jam together, play guitar together. And I had this like kind of crappy drum set in my basement. And so we would eventually we would sort of switch back and forth. Like he would play guitar, and I'd play drums, and vice versa. And then we got our friend Randall to sing with us, and so we wrote like all these songs, and they weren't amazing, but it was a fun thing to do. And over time, I kind of started to notice that Beeve was getting way better at guitar than I was, and I think part of it is I think he just has a lot of natural ability, but also he played a lot, he practiced a lot, which is something that never really came to me. I didn't really have that same kind of dedication. So I kind of decided just to sort of switch over to drums, and we kept sort of writing songs, and actually he was singing for a while.
Interesting.
For a while we were called Jabba the Butt.
Nice.
So it was one of the incarnations of that. And we kind of like kept playing throughout high school together, but we never really went anywhere with it. Like I think we'd maybe bring in, I can't remember if we brought anyone else in, but it was mostly just us. And then I started playing with a couple of other bands, just so that I could play gigs. And I played drums in like an Oi band called the Mahasamrats, and I sang in a pop punk band. And then I met this guy named Dave Kutch through the music scene. I kind of got involved in like kind of basement shows and kind of the PC music scene and all that stuff. And I really kind of gelled with him musically. And I was like, well, why don't we start a band, and I'll bring on board my old friend that I've been playing with on and off for all this time. And that band became a band called March December Swing. And that was like mine, Beeve, and Kutch's like first band. We had this bassist named Kevin. And we played around for a while. We played basement shows and played with a lot of hardcore bands, but we were actually quite a sort of poppy, like emo band. So we, as a result of that, we were able to play with all sorts of different kinds of bands and all that stuff. But eventually we sort of reached the limits of what we wanted to do with that musically from March December Swing. And so we, Giant Sons was sort of born out of that.
What was the decision like to stay an instrumental band instead of, like finding a vocalist and going that whole route?
Well, it's funny because like at the time, after March Timber Swing, we were all really into listening to like Bruce Springsteen and sort of, I don't know if you remember that band Chamberlain. Have you ever heard them?
Yeah,
Or,
absolutely.
Like,
They're great.
yeah. And like Split Lip and the Constantines as well were sort of starting on. So we were really into sort of raspy kind of like, roots rocky kind of thing. And so we actually did think about getting a singer at one point. But then like, as we were writing songs, we started to realize that maybe a lot of them wouldn't necessarily fit that well with vocals. And as you know from Beeve's guitar playing, it's pretty intricate.
Yeah.
And kind of almost has harmonies like built into it. And incidentally, Kutch had switched from guitar that he played in March Timber Swing to bass. So we were sort of kind of worked well as a sort of instrumental power trio. And so we decided just to kind of stick with it because we liked what we were doing.
I absolutely love that. Well, tell me how you guys got on the radar of G7 Welcoming Committee. How did that collaboration all come to pass? Because I know you did the anthology with G7. So was it like a post band, like re-release? Like what did that go? How did that go for you guys?
Well, we were friends with them. And so like, Chris and Todd and George used to come to our shows. And Derek, who Beef plays with now in Agassi, was a big fan of ours, big supporters, especially Chris and Derek, I think. And we sort of, we just kind of were friends, and they liked our music. And unfortunately, it happened posthumously that it came out. And to be honest, like Giant Sons, I think in our time were pretty unsung. Like we weren't really particularly successful. It was only sort of after the fact, obviously after especially Beef joined Propaganda, but even just after we were around, that people started to kind of care, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious about your post Giant Sons band that you and Beef did, Rough Music. What's the story behind Rough Music? Because that's something that you brought to my attention recently in our Twitter messaging, and I didn't even know that existed. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So so Kutch moved away, and so Giant Sons, we split. Although we actually did a reunion show years later once G7 put out our material, which was pretty cool at the Albert. Beav and I still wanted to continue playing music, and we kind of there was a Winnipeg hardcore band called Standstill, and I think Giant Sons might have played a gig with them. I can't remember, but anyway, they were also sort of breaking up, so we kind of just merged with a bunch of the members from Standstill and formed Rough Music, and that was in some ways, I think Beav and I kind of thought of it as like. Initially, we kind of thought that it might be the sort of Constantines-esque or whatever band that we didn't start earlier, and it was pretty fun playing with Rough Music. I really liked some of the songwriting that we did, and we kind of we actually toured a bit more successfully than Giant Sons.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, Giant Sons toured, but it was.
Unsuccessfully.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun. It was really fun. It was mostly just basement shows with our friends, the Down and Out, who Ryan Nash played in, who was on this before. But so Rough Music was us trying to sort of kind of make a slight more of a go of it, I guess, like musically, at least for me anyway. And we played some really fun gigs. Like we played at Casa del Popolo in Montreal, which is like, affiliated with Godspeed You Black Emperor. So that was a really cool show. We played a few dates with this band called Fake Cops, who were really good. So it was fun, but eventually, that also kind of ran its course. I was looking to go to grad school, and actually, like while we were in Rough Music, Chris, Hannah from Propaganda started talking to Beav and I about maybe like jamming with him sometime. And I was like, man, like I'm too afraid to sort of take that on board because like I'm going to be moving away, and that would be so cool. And But so Beeve started jamming with him while we were in Rough Music still.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of, I don't really know how much they got done at that point, but yeah. And then that, as I said, that sort of petered out.
Yeah. Well, and Chris tells the story of meeting Beeve. I think it was in his Without Love episode that he did on his Patreon page. I think he talks about like going out with Beeve and like trying to like talk to Beeve about like joining Propaganda and coming over. And he's got these like demo recordings of he and Beeve playing guitar together in his basement before Beeve was in the band. Really cool stuff. So that's really awesome. But I know that listeners will also want your perspective on something else that Propaganda did when Beeve joined that band, and that's the adaptation of Tertium Non Datur, adapted from Repairing the Damaged Beard by Giant Sons. And I'm just curious about like your perception on like that story of like of this song becoming a Propaganda song when it was originally a Giant Sons song.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously very cool. Like
amazing.
We were, David Kutch and I were thrilled when Beeve told us they were going to do it. And I can remember seeing them play it live for the first time. I was like, oh my God, it was amazing. And I think, I can't remember if Beeve played me a recording of it before I actually heard it on the final, but hearing it, like, as a drummer, obviously hearing Jord play it so much better and differently too. Like, he changed it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was really cool. And to be honest, like in writing the song and stuff, like I could never imagine vocals over it and then it, sort of really it gave me an appreciation for Chris's ability as well as a songwriter. I mean, I already knew Beeves and I was already a fan of Propagandis, but yeah, just to hear it kind of mesh with your own kind of creation. It was very cool.
I love it. Well, you mentioned grad school and everything, and post music, you got into higher ed, became a scholar of 18th century British and transatlantic literature and culture. And I'm curious, like, where these academic interests come in. Like, how did you start becoming interested in this stuff, and what led you into like pursuing a PhD program at McMaster? Because PhD programs aren't for everybody, and I'm just curious what drew you to that path.
Well, I mean, it was interesting in Winnipeg. Like the punk scene that I was involved in was pretty like literate, I guess. Like there was a lot of like, so I was kind of around. I hung out a lot at Mondragon, or the Mondragon, as everyone called it, which is where G7's offices were. And I used to there was like an anarchist library that I like volunteered in. And I would always buy books from there and just read a lot. And, it was definitely listening to Propaganda and Bad Religion and stuff that kind of got me into academic pursuit. Although I'm what I study more so is literature. I'm a professor of English, but and then I was just kind of, I was just sort of driven forward in those interests and that were ignited through punk rock and through a sense of political community. And I just wanted to pursue that further, and so I did.
I love it.
And it was a hard, yeah.
Of course, yeah.
I was going to say it was hard to move away from Winnipeg, but once I did move away, I knew that I could never go back.
Interesting. Yeah, like I'm originally from Missouri, and like I live in New York now, and I've lived in Saskatoon, I lived in Hawaii for a while, I lived in London for a while, and so I sort of have that feeling of caring about where I come from, but also being like, well, I'm here now, and so kind of thinking about it like that, and relationship to place is always something that really fascinates me. But so you have a book, The Savage and Modern Self, North American Indians in 18th Century British Literature and Culture, which University of Toronto Press put out in 2018. And in the book, you examine the representations of North American Indians in novels, poetry, captivity narratives, plays, and material culture from 18th century Britain, which I found to be such a fascinating focus for a book. And you argue that the depictions of Indians in British literature were used to critique and articulate evolving ideas about consumerism, colonialism, like this concept of Britishness and the modern self. And I'd love to know about the impetus for this book and how you came to your this as your academic specialty. Like, tell me about these topics that you care about and kind of where that originates.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of that is definitely coming from Winnipeg. My own background is Indigenous. My dad is Mi'kmaq, and I'm a member of First Nation in New Brunswick. And, Winnipeg is a city that has a lot of Indigenous people. It also has a lot of racism. And maybe we'll sort of talk more about that,
Sure.
I guess, as we talk about the song. But I always wanted to sort of understand the roots of why people think about Indigenous people in certain ways, besides, the material existence of people in Winnipeg. And so, as somebody who was studying 18th century literature, I was like trying to find where do I fit into here? Where do Indigenous people fit into here? And so it just so happened that through my grad work, that kind of became my focus, and now it's kind of become my life. And literally, like I'm teaching a class now on that very subject at Princeton. So it's kind of it's just who I am now.
It's a lot of it's a lot of personal history. You had the music scene, you have like your family, you have like the different areas where you come from. I mean, I see it all as like a really natural melding of your life story, it seems like.
Totally. And also even more so like living in London and, kind of searching for kind of traces of Indigenous presence, like in the British Museum or whatever, that kind of stuff.
Wow. Nice. Tell me about the positions you've held academically. Like, what have your teaching appointments been over the years? Because I know you live in the UK, but you teach at Princeton, and I'm kind of curious how all this works. So tell me a little bit about your career path.
Initially I did a postdoc at Carleton, or University of Ottawa rather, in sort of museum studies, so kind of like a cross-disciplinary thing. And then I had my first job here in the UK in Canterbury at the University of Kent. And I was a senior lecturer there. And then now I've been hired as a professor at Princeton. So I'm a tenure track professor at Princeton, but I haven't moved. So I'm, because of the pandemic, I'm kind of stranded in the UK. And, it would be challenging to move in the middle of all this. And I'm planning to move to New York City as well. So it's a bit difficult with everything. And so it's, fortunately, Princeton's been very flexible, and I've been doing all my teaching from here.
Wow.
So it's fine. Like, I mean, right now, especially it's only 4 hours separation. So it's a bit easier. Usually it's 5 hours.
Yeah.
It's a bit hard to start a job remotely, of course, but I don't get to meet my colleagues, and the campus at Princeton is beautiful, so I don't get to experience that at all. But
So this is your first year as a professor at Princeton, then, like during this massive crisis that we've been facing.
Yeah.
Well, good on you for taking that chance and then just rolling with the punches and doing your best, because that's got to be wild. Because I'd imagine that the first year of an appointment at Princeton would be just something that so many scholars would just like be just so ecstatic to experience. I mean, what a thrill to have that position, but then to like get that at this like very strange time must be very disorienting and kind of odd to experience.
It's so weird. I mean, it happened like I got the job offer kind of right as you were hearing these trickling news reports coming out of Asia about, this new virus. And, and then I got the offer in kind of like, I don't know, mid-February last year. And then, because I went over there, like I flew over, I was in New York City and I went to Princeton and all that stuff like last January with no sense that any of this would happen.
Wow.
And then, obviously it's a bit crazy. And, initially I was going to move over, and then I was just going to stay on campus. And then, campus wasn't even open last semester. And it's wild.
Wow. Well, segueing awkwardly, we'll go back to Propaganda a little bit. How did you first come to like know about and appreciate this band that Keith and I and our listeners are just so in love with?
Well, I have a pretty long history with them, actually. So I first saw them in, I believe it was 1992.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And it was at the gig where they signed to Fat Records. It was a NoFX. So I kind of like, I'd watched a skateboarding video probably about a year earlier, the Plan B Questionable video. And I heard this like punk rock music, right? And so I went to the local skateboarding shop, Skate in Winnipeg, which is a really important place for Winnipeg punk, especially people sort of my age. And I went and bought a bunch of punk tapes and kind of would buy them as they came out. And then I found out that NoFX was coming to to Winnipeg, and so I went, and I remember. I don't remember if I knew whether yeah, I think I did know they were from Winnipeg, but Chris was like, nearly naked on stage.
Yeah.
I think he'd actually written "gay and proud" on his chest.
Nice.
And I remember thinking like, what? Like, I didn't even have a sort of a way to interpret that. Like, I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I knew what being gay meant, but I didn't know, like, in the context. I was like, is he making fun of gay people? Is he whatever? Like, I didn't really understand it. And then I remember them just belting out, fuck religion, fuck religion.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, this is so, I was like 12 or whatever. And I was like, this is amazing. And then, not long after How to Clean Everything came out, and yeah, and sort of have been a fan ever since then.
Wow.
And I can remember the records coming out really clearly. Like, I remember the day that Less Talk, More Rock came out. I went with Beeve's brother, actually, and I went to skate in Corridon, and we bought it. And then that same night, we went to a basement show at the house that Chris lived in. I don't remember what did they call it? Was it the Fisher House? But
yeah, Red Fisher.
And it
I
was
think.
like we saw this band. Yeah, and well, they lived there too. It was like just off Corridon, and we went to see. Actually, this guy I went to my high school's band, Fallen Short, in this basement, and like Chris was there, and I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Yeah, it was awesome.
Amazing. Do you have like favorite records or anything like that? Like, do you have like any like your like peak Propaganda?
I don't know. I don't really have a favorite. I think that, like, definitely when Less Talk, More Rock came out, it really politicized me a lot. And that was amazing. And then I remember like going to protests, especially animal rights protests, and Chris would always be there. And then all the people from the kind of Mondragon scene and all that stuff. And it made me feel like part of a kind of radical community,
Yeah.
For better and for worse, I guess. But it was cool. And then, when Today's Empires came out, I was just like, wow, this band has just hit, just the next level. And then I remember like in the early 2000s when we were playing with Giant Sons and stuff, and I remember talking to Todd one night, and he's like, we were talking about like all this like crazy new bands at the time, like Dillinger Escape Plan were kind of new and all this stuff. And I was like, oh man, like music is just, it's so crazy and technical now. And Todd's like, yeah, we're kind of going in that direction. I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, man, you're going to really like, the new record. And then I guess that was Potemkin. And yeah, and they've just always it's so impressive how much they like challenged themselves, I think.
Yeah. It's like every record that comes out, it's like it for so many years, it's been like, this is like a peak musical output. Like, you can tell that they worked as hard as they possibly can on these songs. Like, there's no phoning it in, you know what I mean, at all.
Oh, totally. I remember Beeve, he's probably talked about this before on the show, but him talking to me about like, but like writing songs with Todd too, who people don't think of as, as the sort of guitarist in the band, because he plays bass in the band, but like, yeah, to him just saying like, the guitar parts that he comes up with and just how just like wild they are and just so creative.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not surprising because like I was a big I Spy fan, but.
Yeah, I have a vivid memory of standing in the basement of Louis in Saskatoon on the U of S campus when Propaganda were playing there on their tour that they did in support of Supporting Cast with Rebel Spell. And I was standing down there and I was talking to Todd's brother, Kent, and Todd came over and we got to talking about Supporting Cast. And he's like, yeah, when me and Beav were rehearsing and trying to get those riffs down for Night Letters, he's like, we just played that song for days, like over and over and over and over and over. And like, it's one of those things, like, to show like the craft that goes into it is like, I remember this so clearly. And, it's because like it was Todd and I was just meeting him for the first time essentially, but it just stands out in my memory about like the work ethic came out right away, Yeah.
I mean, I remember Beeve, shortly after he joined the band, he came and visited me when I was living in Toronto, and we decided to rent a practice space. And then, and like David came into town as well. He was living in Montreal at the time. And Beeve, we decided to try jamming a couple of Propaganda songs because, of course, Beeve was And that was the other crazy thing, is that like when we were in Giant Sons, we practiced like once a week.
Yeah.
And practice was only an excuse so that we would go drinking afterwards. You know, like Friday night, like we'd meet at like, I don't know, 6, we'd jam till 9, and then we'd just go get wasted at Cousins. You know,
Yeah.
that was what we did. Whereas Beav and Propaganda, it's like we're jamming like every day. Like it was so much work, and I was so amazed by that. But anyway, we all got together and jammed as Giant Sons, but Beav played a couple of Propaganda songs. I was just like, I remember Night Letters specifically, like I was just trying to play drums along to it. And I was like, this is so wild. I don't know, like, you know, just that process of coming up with that it's incredible.
I love it. Well, Robbie, we've got a song that we're going to get into here in a second, Oka Everywhere, which is on the I'd Rather Be Flag Burning split that came out on CD with G7 and on 10-inch from Recess Records. I'm curious about your memories of this release in general. I'd Rather Be Flag Burning. What does this release mean in the scope of your life?
Well, I remember being really excited when it came out. As I was a big fan of I Spy. You know, going to see them play was amazing. And they initially, when the CD came out, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think I bought it on a zine table at the West End Cultural Center, and it came in a gift CD.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like whatever, some crappy CD envelope that just had a little sticker on it.
Did you get one of the
cardboard.
handmade ones?
Yeah, it was just like cardboard. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have it somewhere, I think. And actually, I think I bought it from John Sampson.
Nice.
Who was also selling his zine, Plap Equals Crap, which was amazing. Chris wrote some stuff for that. It was a really funny zine. And yeah, I just remember listening to it and just, you know, obviously loving it. It was awesome. And yeah, and of course, hearing the other version of Haley Slass and all that stuff. It's very cool.
What was the name of that John K. Sampson zine again? Because I'm going to send that title over to the Weaker Thans focused podcast friend of mine. What is that called again?
Well, I don't know if it was like a joke title on it, but it was Plap Equals Crap. I think it might have been. It was just like a pun on PC.
Okay.
Because it was like from the PC punk scene. And one of the things I remember from it was that Chris wrote a review of the roller coasters at Six Flags, or one of the fun amusement parks in California.
Yeah.
Because he'd gone to record FYP there, I think, and so he recorded he and his reviews of the roller coasters all end with him shitting his pants. So it's really, really funny, and it's like however many, like the rating was like 3 pants shitting out of 5 or whatever.
Nice. I wonder if he has those. I wonder if he has those on like a floppy drive somewhere. We'll have to dig into that.
So it was John Sampson and Todd Scarth who put it out, and they of course later formed Arbeiter Ring. And yeah, and it was some of it was one of the other things actually I remember in that zine was an amazing interview with Jawbreaker. Which was like right before they signed to a major label. It was big. Jawbreaker played in Winnipeg with I Spy, actually. Yeah, but anyway, so that's when I got that I Spy Propaganda split.
Did you go to that Jawbreaker I Spy show?
Sadly, I did not. No.
Dang it.
No.
Awesome. I loved hearing Ryan Nash tell stories of seeing I Spy live. Have you seen I Spy?
Oh yeah.
Tell me about I Spy Live really quick before we get into our song here. Like, tell me about that energy.
I mean, they were amazing. Ryan mentioned that really hot show at the West End Cultural Center, which was definitely a very, very hot show. I saw them play a few times. I saw them play a basement show once, which was amazing. Yeah, it was just like, you know, Todd going off. I was friends with the drummer from I Spy, James, and he was like, I just loved him so much as a drummer. He just played so idiosyncratically. Like, no, I've never seen anybody play drums like him. He just infused like jazz and world music and all this stuff into like hardcore drumming. It was just like so cool. And so they were very musical, actually. Like, you know, technically, it's like, I think in some ways people think of them as being this kind of like sloppy, like hardcore, but you know, there was actually a real, not precision, but just sort of skill, like jazz-like skill to them live, I think, but also total amazing energy.
Did their drummer James, did he like look interesting while playing? Because like I'm thinking about like certain drummers, like watching them play, they look different than a lot of drummers. Like Bill Stevenson looks a certain way when he plays.
Yeah.
Nick from a Wilhelm Scream looks a certain way when he plays. Like they have a certain feel and position that makes them that lends to their sort of the signature sound, where when you hear it on a record, you're like, oh, that's Bill Stevenson, or oh, that's Nick from Wilhelm Scream. Like, did James have that kind of energy too?
Totally, totally. I mean, when he played, he kind of looked like he was about to like fall off his chair.
Mm.
You know, he was kind of leaning back, almost like just a real jazz feel to it.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, he was awesome, and like I said, totally new. He actually plays drums also on that that Painted Thin split with John Sampson. That's James playing drums in that as well.
Sweet.
And he played in a couple bands with Steve Carroll from the Weekend as well, called Shadowboxer. I think he played with that, at least sometimes anyway. But yeah, I Spy were amazing to see live. They were so good.
That's awesome. Well, okay, so Robbie, when I reached out to you about appearing on the show, which we've been talking about for ages now, so thank you for your patience with me as I work my way through my ridiculous project I've got going on here. I asked if you would appear on the Oka Everywhere episode. And I wanted to discuss the title first, but so let's go over the basics and then we'll get into more about what the song means to you. But what is Oka? When I say Oka to a Canadian person, such as yourself, someone who grew up, born and raised in Canada and has First Nations family, what is Oka? Tell me about this term.
Well, Oka was a massive conflict that happened between the Mohawk people and Canadian settlers, and then ultimately the Canadian state. But it was over a golf course. It was like this sort of unceded land that the Mohawks had put in a land claim for, and then they had lost it in court. And also, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it's also tied to a Mohawk burial ground as well. But in any case, it was contested Indigenous land. And these developers wanted to build this like golf course and condos. Actually, the main money behind it was the people that owned Trivial Pursuit. I remember that. Yeah, gaming millionaires. But and so the Mohawks decided to form a blockade to prevent the development of this land. And I think fairly early on in the blockade, a cop was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of escalated things. And, they sent in the state, and there's all these kind of very famous, iconic images of Indigenous people sort of facing off against military people. But it really sort of was kind of the first like really visible Indigenous uprising in Canada that people knew in living memory. Was this moment of these Mohawks in camouflage and face cloths standing their ground against the military.
Yeah. Well, and what really stands out to me, so I've been like digging into this a little bit, but I grew up in Missouri in the States. So it's like, this is so detached from my life in general. But something that really stood out to me, and I was digging into this, is like, there was a long series of campaigns, petitions, protests, city council, like visits and things like that long before the blockade ever happened. And essentially, they were rebuffed over and over. Does that sound right to you? Like before they went to the blockade, like they did all the things that like citizens are encouraged to do in the face of government action. Does that sound right?
Oh, totally. And also there's in a climate of extreme racism that exists. And I mean, like there's all these stories of like the local French Canadians like calling them savages and all this stuff. So it was very, very heightened tension and kind of the start of a lot of what we see today.
Yeah.
In Indigenous strategies of resistance.
Yeah. And so like, I think that the town or the First Nation is Kanasatake, and they also were joined in that resistance by the Ganawaga, who did like a bridge blockade, like going into Montreal, like there was like there's this massive bridge that was taken, like in solidarity with the Kanasatake. And that was so amazing because like I saw somewhere that like 100,000 people would use that bridge per day to like go to their jobs in like downtown Montreal. And it was like totally blocked. And I mean, it's just such an amazing story. And, obviously everybody in Canada knows about the water polo Olympian Wani Corn Miller, who like got stabbed while holding her 4-year-old sister, Kenetio Horn, who also appears in Letterkenny as Tanis. Like there is so much amazing history that just happens in this event. What do you remember about 1990? Like, were you watching this on television, like along with the rest of the country as well as a young person?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my dad is Native, and he worked for Indian Affairs at the time, and so I mean, provincially in Manitoba, but nonetheless, yeah, of course, my family was very aware of it, and we watched it. I mean, I was too young to really understand the implications or what any of it meant, but I just remember it seeming so serious that there would be like tanks and soldiers with guns and all this stuff. It was wild. And it was, within a couple of years of that, well, probably around the time of hearing the record, the Propaganda song, I kind of realized the importance of that event. And in some ways it's kind of singularity, like nothing like that had really yet happened. Mm-hmm. So it was a, a big thing.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like the military escalated it halfway through, right? It seemed like there was like these like, normal police officers like dealing with the blockade for like 40-ish days or so. And then like they brought in like these like anti-aircraft weapons and tanks. And like it seemed like the Canadian government just escalated it a millionfold halfway through. I mean, that just really kind of blew me away that they took on the tactic of making it exponentially worse whenever it was already weeks and weeks in. And it seems like they did that because the Quebecois population started like rioting and like demanding the government go in there and crush it. And I was just like watching this, just like, wow, this is just so challenging to think about. And, just the centuries of colonial, like pushing people down under a thumb and just expecting them to back down no matter what. And when they didn't, it's like, hey, let's send in the tanks and just mess everybody up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I definitely, one thing I appreciated in going to graduate school closer to Mohawk territory was that's kind of, they're sort of forced into these kinds of violent confrontation because there's constant incursions onto their territory. Mm-hmm. So because they're around these massive urban centers like Montreal, in the case of Ganawage and these other places. Near where I lived in Hamilton, there's all this development as well around Six Nations. So yeah, it's a huge it's a huge thing to contest against settler colonialism.
So in your view, knowing that this is sort of like the first hugely visible Native resistance against, things that happened, like they were broadcast all over television. Everybody in Canada knew that this was happening. What does the term Oka Everywhere, the title of the song, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned briefly earlier that Winnipeg is a very racist city. And I think a lot of people that are sympathetic to that situation, to Indigenous people, rather, not sympathetic to Winnipeg being a racist city,
yeah,
but would like to see more kind of more of that resistance. And people don't really know where to begin. People know it all feels, in Winnipeg, it all feels very intractable. It feels like a city that will forever be incredibly racist, and it may well be. And to me, I think I suppose as a concept, Oka Everywhere would just be to sort of face down settler colonialism at every instance that one can. On a basic level.
I love it. Well, in the tune, we have Chris witnessing these events on television like the rest of Canada. And you sort of like mentioned like what it means to you generally. Like, so I'm curious about like what you like about the lyrics of the song in general? Like, are there any lines that really like grab you as being like, oh, that's such a great line, or I love this for whatever reason?
I actually was just reading, and you've probably come across this too, but I was just reading this interview that Chris did with Canadian Dimension magazine.
Yeah, I saw that.
Which I have to shout out because friends of mine have worked there in the past. It's a Winnipeg-based socialist magazine, very good. But yeah, they do this sort of oral history of Oka Everywhere, and Chris mentions that he feels kind of embarrassed about the first line because he mentions sort of celebrating the death of this cop. And he's like, well, actually, that's I regret writing that because he's a real person, and I don't know anything about that. And that, to be honest, was a line that really struck out at me when I was younger. Like, I was like, whoa, he's kind of flippantly talking about killing this cop being killed. That was pretty intense for sure at the time. And I probably felt the same way as Chris did at that time, and similarly feel the same way now, that maybe it's more complicated. But the other part of it that I really liked, listening then and now, is him drawing attention to the sort of just the pervasive nature of racism towards Indigenous people in Canada. Like in Winnipeg, it was standard for people to say, I'm not racist, but I hate Indians. That was like, you'd hear that like in the suburbs. I like to think that you wouldn't now, but I don't know. And it talks about the girls at work. They still deny their racism. They claim tolerance for all. But and that's it. Like, there's this sort of exception for Indigenous people in the prairie provinces, especially, where people actually even just any settler kind of just instantly or instinctively hates Indians. That's kind of how the dynamic was in the prairie provinces when I was growing up. And so I thought that was really powerful to hear that. And just to say, like, Native people don't need the approval of Canadian society to resist. I like that. I feel like one of the things I really appreciate, and I've always appreciated about Chris's politics, is that he doesn't try to sort of appropriate resistance. Instead, he's a true ally. He writes things in the true spirit of solidarity. Like, I want to understand this, and I want to support that autonomy of that group. And I think that song does quite a good job of that.
Yeah, that was something that I was thinking about asking you as well. Like, what does it mean for a guy in a visible band who is a white male, singing to largely white male audiences in the 90s? What does it mean to have that kind of figure singing about these issues and siding essentially with who at that time would have been seen as like the other side, like the victims of racism? He's like calling everybody out in the audience. Like, that's such a powerful thing to consider when you're singing to a room full of people who would just casually and flippantly say, I'm not racist, but, you know what I mean? And then you have this guy on stage just lecturing them about exactly doing what they're doing. It's really remarkable, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I remember, like, because like I said, I was sort of part of this kind of like whatever PC hardcore scene, as it was sort of called at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember us being like at propaganda shows, and he would be so confrontational to the audience, And he'd basically be like, you're a bunch of fucking idiots. Like, it was kind of the like, and this was like early days or whatever.
Yeah.
Or like, there was this show he played at the Pyramid where he stripped totally naked, and then he like took electrical tape and like tied like a beer can to his dick and all this stuff. Like, it was really like, it was just kind of confrontational. And that was obviously what, Less Talk is kind of addressing that, obviously. But yeah, I really, it felt empowering, I guess, to feel like, these like jocks that are here are not like going to dominate us or whatever. We have our sort of champion on stage. And I think that meant a lot to a lot of people. And especially like, if people were like violently moshing or whatever, they would always sort of intervene or kind of like shame people, to be like, I remember at one gig, I don't remember which one, but definitely an early one. And there was all these people moshing, and after the show he's like, you know, you don't have to do what they do on MTV or whatever. Like, I mean, I'm sure he would kind of cringe at that now, like it feel, but at the same time, at that moment in the 90s, like that felt like, yeah, like, you know, this is just a sort of, you're sort of mirroring the dominant culture rather than actually producing a model of equity and you know, difference that's actually punk.
You know, and I really like that about Propaganda too, because like I am not a mosh pit person as well. And it feels like every show I go to, the singer is just saying, all right, everybody move. Let's get this place moving. And I'm like, I just want to watch competent musicians perform songs well. And I want to appreciate the musicianship of what is happening on the stage. And if I'm moshing, I literally miss the entire show. Because what are you doing when you're moshing? You're trying not to get punched in the face. You're trying not to get leveled by somebody, which means you're not watching the band that you paid to watch. And I understand people have different ways of expressing themselves within live music settings and everything like that. But I feel like it's so cool that like if 300 or 400 people went to a Propaganda show, like Propaganda themselves wouldn't care if a single person moved during the show. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
the energy can be there in other ways besides ramming our bodies against each other. And that's something that I really like about them in live settings.
Oh, totally. Actually, the last time I saw them was a little over a year and a half ago or whatever, and they were in London. And I took a couple friends, and we ended up getting like proper seats in like a balcony looking down, which was awesome. It was like proper, like, you know, old punk vibe.
It's comfortable.
Like, you know, it was so great. We were just sitting there, and it was like great views.
Yeah.
Oh, it was awesome. It was so good. And yeah, and but even the crowd weren't, you know, they weren't. I mean, I think there probably were some people moshing, but yeah, it was awesome.
I love it. Well, what do you love about the musical performance of Oka? We got this John K. Samson era song. It's a banger. Tell me what you think about the musical performance.
Yeah, I mean, I love the classic, like, you know, sort of the clean strummed and arpeggiated chords into the monster riff. So good. Like, it's so like, it's a very kind of skate punk song, I guess, really, compared to what they would become. But yeah, I mean, it's great. That weird fast timing that Jord does. It's so like comes from thrash metal, but like played to pop punk. And then of course the great like sort of harmonized riff in the end. Mm-hmm. I can remember seeing that live, actually. I went to see them play, I think this is another one of the Pyramid shows, and I had this really crappy like tape recorder, like with like micro cassette.
Yeah.
That you would do. Yeah. And I think I had it, I think I borrowed it maybe from Stylus magazine. I used to write for that magazine. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was Beeves. I can't remember. But anyway, I recorded them live. Nice. And it sounded terrible, obviously. Like it sounded awful, like totally unusable. But I remember that song. And I don't know if that record had come out yet. But anyway, and I just remember hearing that riff cutting through so clearly. You know, that's just like, it was so good. And just live, it sounded so awesome.
Man, I've talked to other people about this, but I'm actually really surprised that this song didn't wind up going on Less Talk More Rock. Are you surprised by that at all? Because like, it's such a great song and it was ready to go and it just didn't go on the record. And I'm actually really confused by that decision.
Yeah, totally. And especially because like, you know, as we know, the recording quality isn't great.
Right.
Compared to stuff they would do later. So it would have been so cool to hear it, like, you know, more slick production. Yeah, I don't really know what the reasoning. Maybe it was that first line about the cop thing, or I don't know. I'm not really sure what I have no idea what the reasoning was.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there was like, because like Nation States does go on Less Talk. Woe Is Me does not, which is a reasonable decision. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, Woe Is Me is a great song, and we did an episode about it with Beeve, and like we totally geeked out on it because for what it is. But like, it really shocks me at like how important the content is of Oka Everywhere and how it doesn't go on arguably their most famous record of all time. That's just an interesting decision for me, because I feel like it really could have brought awareness to the Indigenous Canadians like issues that were going on in the day. But it is what it is, you know. And I'm not.
Well,
I can't litigate that.
No, you can't. But it's true. Like when I think about, because that record, I feel like the songs that they still play from that are definitely the animal rights ones, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really powerful to see, you know, as somebody who's been vegan for over 20 years, like, you know, that one when they stop and when he just says consider someone else, and then the whole crowd like yells in response, stop consuming animals. It would have been kind of cool to have seen like I don't know what, I don't even know what a line from that song would, I guess, that would become anthemic, but to see, like, I just imagine as a Native person having people like yelling about Native resistance all around me would be so cool.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean,
such
because
is life.
you think about like the power of like Bringer of Greater Things, which talks about the Starlight tours of cops in Saskatoon, ditching people in the middle of the wilderness when it's like -30 outside. And this is just like, this song is like a companion to that. It's like these like stories that Propaganda like weaves between their releases. And I see like Oka and Bringer of Greater Things and, you know, Cut into the Earth and Night Letters like being like this like ongoing story that's being told of marginalized human beings all over the world. And I just love this song so much. But my appreciation of this song is slightly more recent. Like I've really just come to grasp the power of what this song stands for really just within the last year. I've always liked it, but like it's so much more than that to me now.
Yeah, totally. No, it's great. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in a while, to be honest, either. As you say, like, yeah, Bringer of Greater Things and stuff. In many ways, I feel like besides being musically more mature, I think also in terms of ideas are a bit more rich, I guess.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, if we now look at the current sites of Indigenous struggle, they're all land-based. You know, if we think about the water protectors, we think about Wet'suwet'en and all the stuff. And I think that like, in that sense, it's a really prescient song. You know, it really speaks to how Indigenous resistance can carry on and did carry on from that moment.
I love the that this is still present within their lives as well. Like the flag I see in the Oka news footage from 1990 is the same flag that's hanging on the wall in the Failed Imagineer video. You know, the Oka standoff seems to continue to inspire propaganda to this very day, you know. And I was watching an interview with Wanique Hornmiller where the BBC journalist or the CBC journalist who was interviewing her says that Oka was kind of the beginning of awareness of Indigenous land issues. And, you know, I'm curious if you agree, like, how did you watch these issues unfold over the decades after Oka? Like, are there any other like big examples that really jump out at you as maybe being inspired by Oka that carried on this movement?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's directly, and it's certainly a lot more kind of like liberal and mainstream. But in the subsequent years following that, obviously, we have the Truth and Reconciliation papers that came out by the Canadian government in an attempt to sort of reconcile with Indigenous people. And that ostensibly has supposed to be Canada kind of having a reckoning with the horrible things that it's done to Indigenous people. Of course, it hasn't really played out that way. And as we see, that kind of resistance, that kind of articulation of recognition hasn't really worked as a framework. So I think Oka, by contrast, provides a much more, I guess, less embedded in the state way of resistance. And so, you know, it's inspiring. I mean, with my own people, the Mi'kmaq people, you know, there's been a lot of intention because of there's been huge conflict with the fisheries that were happening in the East Coast, and a lot of extreme violence by white or non-Indigenous fishers. And so we see that actually what has the sort of framework of reconciliation really done? Nothing. You know, so as a result, we still need more sort of on the ground resistance, not just, you can't reconcile, or you can't legislate reconciliation, you know, at least not as it stands now. And in fact, it has to be, you know, settler colonialism has to be sort of resisted on the ground.
Well, Robbie, you've been listening to Propaganda for, it seems like, almost 3 decades at this point. And I'm just curious, like, if you can summarize, like, kind of what this band means to you over the course of your life as a person who cares about the world, as a musician, as like an appreciator of art. Tell me what Propaganda means.
Oh man, well, I mean, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about them is that, you know, they're such, I guess the old term for this thing is like organic intellectuals.
Mm.
You know, they're people that have a real instinct for what I consider to be goodness and decency in the world. And so that's a huge thing for me about them. But also, like, weirdly, that is also sort of paralleled in their music, uh, their musical ability and evolution. So I feel like in some ways, as they've evolved as human beings, I've also evolved as a human being alongside that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, it was really cool a few years ago when Beeve first joined Propaganda. They came to the UK and they were touring. Well, I mean, they've been a few times since, but they only came once while I was here with Beeve. And they were touring with Comeback Kid, who I also happen to be friends with. So I actually went on the tour with them.
Nice.
Which was awesome. It was so sick. And also my friend, David, who I don't know if you've had him on the show before, Hugel, but.
Oh, no, I don't know David Hugel. I'm going to have David Kutch on the show sometime too.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, the other David is sometime tour manager of the band.
Yeah.
So he's also like another friend that was also on this tour. But, you know, going on that tour with them, we went to, like, you know, just a couple of places in England and then Glasgow. Did we go to Edinburgh? I can't remember. But it was amazing to see, like, how much they mean to other people as well. And I feel like it used to be in the early 2000s when you'd go to a Propaganda show, I always felt like most of the people at the show were like the worst people. You know, like most of them were just kind of like bros. What did you say? Like first world frat boys and Paris. That was like literally that was the vibe for sure. Yeah. You kind of felt like, oh my God, this is like just the sink pit of like white supremacy or something. And that was the weird contradiction with them. But I feel like over time that's changed. And now when I go see them, I feel really elevated by the people around me. Like there's so many, you know, young people into it, but then old people like me that are at it. And it's just, it's awesome to see how much they've connected with people and how much people have been kind of politicized. And I feel like it turns on their own kind of natural politics of fairness, even if they can't articulate those in political ideologies, but there's still kind of, there's a sense of, like, I remember the last time they played here, and this is just like a small thing, but they were playing here with, I think, Reviver.
Oh yeah, that probably sounds right. They toured with Reviver a ton for a couple years.
Yeah. And, you know, Chris just said some like just small like throwaway thing about like, why do people complain about using a person's proper pronouns? Why is that so difficult? Like, just have some respect for people. And just seeing all these, I remember there was like this like old, like just like classic London punk guy, but he was like, yeah, fucking right, just like applauding. Yeah. And I was like, this is awesome. Like, it's so great to see, you know, and he has a way of stating something that's so like matter of fact. And you're like, of course, like, why would I be bothered by that? Like, obviously, you know, just insisting upon the humanity of others is like such a huge thing that they do. And I think that that's just so great. And indeed, not just humans, but obviously like the stuff that they do with animal rights as well. Just a general, I don't know, a general ethics of being that I really appreciate about them a lot.
Awesome. Well, Robbie, I am so grateful that we got to spend this time together and talk about Winnipeg, talk about Propaganda, talk about all these amazing stories where your life overlaps with them, and you know, saying hey virtually to your friend Beeve, who has been so fantastic and engaged with, you know, coming on this podcast, and I'm just thrilled with our conversation today. It means a ton to me that folks such as yourself who have a long and storied history with this band, who probably should be hosting this podcast, are willing to come on and tell these stories and hang out with me. It just means the world. So thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for that fabulous chat on Propagandy, Winnipeg, Giant Sons, Oka Everywhere. What a fantastic guy.
And Greg, you're putting in the work for this episode. You have another guest. Tell us about that guest.
So our second guest is somebody who is really interesting in the history and story of Propagandy. Our second guest is Conrad Sichler. Conrad's name came up on the Head, Chester, Foot episode. Conrad's name appears in the liner notes of Where Quality is Job 1 double 7-inch, the liner notes of Where Quantity is Job number 1 compilation, and the liner notes of How to Clean Everything. In the band member roster, Conrad recorded the demo tracks on the How to Clean Everything 20th anniversary reissue. Conrad is also a musician. He goes by the stage name of Riot Nerd, which was spawned in Winnipeg. And he has a deep connection to Propagandy, John K. Sampson, the early days of this band, because Conrad was the singer for Toothpick Hercules, which was also featured the playing of John K. Sampson and Stephen Carroll. And Toothpick Hercules wrote and recorded the song Leg Hold Trap, which Propagandy later recorded. So just as a little preview, Conrad and I did an interview about Toothpick Hercules and the early days of Propagandy for a super long interview that we're doing for the Leg Hold Trap episode. But we also got deeply into Oka Everywhere for about 20 minutes of our conversation. So this is a piece of a larger conversation that Conrad and I had for the Leg Hold Trap episode. But we talked about Oka for so long that I wanted to include Conrad's perspectives on the importance of Oka and this event in the minds of white Canadian youth and people, and to show you just how transformative a moment of this like this can be for people who witness these kinds of injustices and events. So I snipped a bit of Conrad's interview into this Oka episode. So this is a tiny piece of a longer episode with Dr. Conrad Sichler. So enjoy my chat with Conrad about Oka Everywhere. A while back, whenever we, have folks on this show, we usually, pick a song, and we've had like a totally separate conversation here about, so much events and histories and examples and stories that, this is kind of a jarring transition perhaps. But when I reached out to you about appearing on an episode via your Riot Nerd moniker, I sent you the song list and you landed on Oka Everywhere as a song that you would like to discuss for the podcast. Can you tell me a little bit about why you selected this song?
Well, for one, I knew it. Like, I know their earlier catalog a lot better than their more recent stuff, especially songs by name. Like, so dumb when you start getting into CDs and stuff. It's like, oh, track 5 is the best. Like, well, what's it called? Except for like the scholars, right? Anyway, so number one, I knew the song instantly, and number two, like stuff around in indigenous issues and indigenous settler relationships and my own experiences with indigenous people and ceremony and where I came from kind of the earlier cradle of, right-wing thought, which included a lot of racism, to be honest with you. Like, in terms of my family and their friends, like there's tremendously racist. The social milieu in Winnipeg was super racist. The indigenous people are clustered in Winnipeg largely in the North End, which is the poorer part of the city. And it's like a sort of a form of apartheid, right? So it just was very meaningful to me personally. And the song obviously just rocks, and was probably on that, is obviously on that thing that got rid of my own aggression that one day and many other days like it. So yeah, I don't actually have the vinyl like you just showed me. I have the CD with the water damaged cover.
Love it. It
But
looks
it's
great.
definitely an original. Like this is one of the ones that they've talked about, like gluing in the van, right? So
It is so cool. Beef's got one of those too.
yeah. I think I heard that episode of yours and him. So so it just had a lot of personal resonance for me on a musical level. I was listening to it a bunch in preparation for our talk too. And so like I think it's musically a really, really interesting song too. And part of what it is, it's like I was listening to the Beav episode and he said this thing. I was like, oh God, other people are like that? Because you asked him about the lyrics. He said, you know what, it's weird. I hear a song, I never really hear the lyrics. And I'm the same way. Like I'll hear the music and probably more the drumming first more than anything. And I really have to reach for the lyrics. My wife can like listen to a song 3 times and like remembers all the lyrics. And like I barely can make them out sometimes. So I'm the same way. So like the rhythm of the song is incredible, right? And especially with regard to like some of the like musicians I've worked with, like the really top-notch musicians here to put out my own albums, they're like, if it's a country song, like they get it, right? But if it's a song with George Samoleski drumming that's written by Chris, it's like it changes the rhythm like every 20 seconds or 5, right? And it's like sometimes it's just straight and sometimes it's like this offset rhythm, and then sometimes it's in between those two and it switches, so there's a full stop and then it goes into one or another of those, and it's just like it's just so exciting, like, and so driving, I think, for that reason, right? Like the groove is kind of there, like it has a pattern and a groove, but it's so kind of chaotic in some ways but ordered in this really deeper way, right? So and the lyrics are so supported so well in that form too, right? Like how they come out with the starts and stops and the changes. So like that's something that they do as well as anybody I've ever heard.
Well,
right?
and something that's really interesting to me is this, decades long partnership with Chris and Jord, and you've seen them work together like in the earliest days, like when the era of Oka Everywhere appears. Do you know what it is? Like, can you like verbalize what is special about the relationship between those two guys and their instruments? Like, why do they seem to like just, gel so well together? Because I think about this a lot.
I mean, I guess the people that ask really are the two of them. And I don't think you've had Jord on the podcast. I don't
Not
know if
yet.
you can entice him somehow. So anyway, really only the two of them know. I mean, I can guess, I'll speculate since you asked. I mean, they both grew up in Portage la Prairie, which was about an hour west of Winnipeg. It's a smaller city, maybe 50,000 people, I think. And so the pool of people that you go to high school with there is even smaller than in Winnipeg, right? So there's that picture of Jord on the cover of the Quality's Job 1 7-inch with his big mohawk and all his like punk rock pins, right? I don't know how many punk rockers there would have been in his high school, but certainly like obviously Jord and Chris clicked and they would listen to some of the same music that included some metal and some thrash and stuff. And, at the time, like probably around the time when Fat Records came out with, How to Clean Everything, and it was around the time Nirvana broke, like it started like that kind of grunge punk, like heavier music started to go really mainstream and get super produced, if not overproduced and polished. Like you got to remember, this was just before that, right? So punks were weird. Like they were misfits and outcasts, and there wasn't the sort of pretend punk like was punk, maybe still is, like when Nirvana broke on Geffen, right? So my guess is like they just obviously gelled, and they're both super funny guys. Like Jord is so hilarious, and I really wish I'd had contact with him or more contact over the years, because him and Chris's humor just meshes. Often Jord would be like the butt of Chris's jokes, especially at that point. But he'd just take it in this like amazing way, and I don't know how he did it. I think I must have asked him about that at some point. I have a vague memory that's sort of starting to surface, right? Like, how do you deal with that? But he just sort of is so good-natured and kind that it just seems to roll off of him. And I'm sure Jor would get his licks in, but like Chris is so kind of quick-witted that I think he probably always had the upper hand. But it's just, I don't know, like, it's like, I was thinking about this, right? Like my wife does a bunch of really cool stuff, but she had this vision once, and it had to do with like who we are at our core. And she said the vision she was given was you have to have your name, like your true name, like who you are. You have to have your pipe, which could be like a literal pipe, but it actually is the way that you connect with the bigger world. You have to have your song, which is kind of your expression into the world, right? So the other smart thing she said at some point in our long conversations over the years was talking about a teacher of mine who's kind of a bit of a jerk. She says, well, the teacher is the teaching. It's like how we are is actually the teaching and what we share with others, right? So when we write music, I or Chris or George, it's like an expression of how and who we are, right? So clearly, like they just sort of clicked and meshed, and there was like that deep kind of resonance, right? Because when you write music, like doesn't it come out sounding like how and who you are? Like does for me, it probably does for everybody, right? It's just the attempt to express something that's not really expressible or describable in words, but just like the feel of how it comes out is something that, gives people a felt sense of what that is, right? Which is probably why they tolerated me, even though my politics were so way off at that point in my life. So
Nice. Well, and something else that's really interesting to me about Oka is that whenever we started this podcast, we got a small group of people who followed us on social media who were completely obsessed with the idea of when is the Oka Everywhere episode going to appear in the show. Like, I think that this song has almost like a lore attached to it at this point that, like, if you know, you know. Do you have a sense of that as well? It's not on How to Clean Everything, like their biggest selling record ever, I think. But yet it has this core group of people that are like obsessed with this song. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I honestly can't speak to other people's obsessions. I mean, I think it's a really clear statement, like an anti-colonial statement, at a time when I'm sure there were other people making those kind of statements too, but I didn't know of any at the time, right? And Oka's like was a Canadian thing, although it's a whole Western quote unquote civilization thing that's at the core of that, right? And I don't know if you were aware of it at the time, but I was aware because that was front page news for like 60 days, right? It was on the front page every single day. And I did a bunch of research after it once I kind of changed my politics flipped. And I watched a documentary called Kanasatake, 270 Years of Resistance for some of the background. And I read a bunch of media studies stuff on it. And like the Canadian government they were shits. Like they would produce actual propaganda and say, these are some of the weapons that the indigenous people have. And they had this like stock footage of some like gang bust with like a rocket launcher on a table and like these submachine guns. The truth is they had like one shotgun and like 3 shells. The police officer that got killed was killed by his own police force by accident. But that came out in a tiny little story a year after the whole Oka thing had blown over. Right. So it's kind of my first glimpse into that. And I don't know how much of the obsessions with other folks are like to do with the politics of it. But for me, like that's super duper important. And I've continued to learn about like, what is it to be like a white person in Canada, and what has the history been, and what is the history that's happening right now in it? And in Canada, Oka itself like was just this explosion, like this first thing of that kind of generation of Indigenous activism. Like it galvanized, so far as I'm aware, Indigenous populations across Canada and has led to other subsequent movements that was in previous movements as well, right? So I don't know how many of the propaganda fans are into that stuff, but I certainly am. But I guess you'd have to ask them. I mean, the song is like really brilliantly crafted, I think, for all those kind of rhythmic reasons and changes that I talked about earlier. And it has also some like kind of raw lyrics that are attached to that whole anti-colonial thing too, right? Like,
yeah, talk to me about the lyrics. Like, what are some of your like standout lyrics here that really just grip you as a listener?
I think the first one is kind of like with that break in the song where it's just like it's about an Oka the size of the fist to resist and the will to fight back. It's just like this like thing that probably spoke to every rebel about any issue, right? But then also it's so cleverly and appropriately like connected that kind of punk rock spirit to this really critical issue, I think, for all Western democracies, quote unquote. So that one like really stood out. And then I know the workplace he was talking about, because Chris used to work for CAA, or the Canadian Automobile Association,
Mm-hmm.
triptychs for people and stuff.
Motor
and
League.
Yeah, right. Back to the Motor League, right? So so I could just imagine that office environment. And I vaguely remember having some conversations with him about what it was like at that workplace. Right. But I've had Indigenous people who are my patients tell me stories the exact same kind, like 20 years later after the song was written. Right. Like there was a land reclamation not far from Hamilton at Caledonia. And my one Indigenous patient had her coworkers, like white coworkers, coming up into her face and like asking her to explain what those people were thinking. And she's like, well, a lot of Indigenous people think a lot of different things. Like, I don't know much about the issue actually, but she was just up in her face. And I was like, why don't you ask her why those Wall Street white corporate criminals are stealing money from people? She should know, she's white.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's like just that sense, especially once you're attuned to racism, like there's 27 million girls at work here, which was accurately, actually, Chris got that right. That was the actual population of Canada at the time. So although I just called him out earlier in our conversation about his world population figures, these were actually quite accurate. So I tip my cap to his geography knowledge in this song.
Yeah, and you're getting at something really important there about like racism and bullying within society, where a person within a dominant like group will ask a single human being from a different group to answer for everybody within their group. And it is like one of the most daily, most ever present forms of racism and bullying. And just the thumb that still holds people down. It's like a subservience methodology used to bully people into submission.
For sure. And the flip side that's intended to be complimentary is equally insulting.
Mm-hmm.
Like basically anything that smacks of like, oh my God, you made it through college. Well, you're a credit to your race.
Yeah.
And people probably wouldn't use that phrase, but that's the implication, right? And it's like, wow, like no one says, wow, you're white and you graduated from accounting. You're a credit to the white race. Like,
yeah. Oh,
it's that rule where you just flip the races, right? Which race is obviously a social contract, but you flip it in any statement, you change the color, and you see if the statement still makes sense. And if it makes no sense, it's a pretty good indicator that what the original phrase is racist. But and then also the other line that sticks out for me is, imagine fighting that 500 years, right? So again, connecting that kind of punk rock ethos of fighting against stuff and putting in this much bigger context. Like the song gets that depth to it, right? And connects it to something bigger than, what punk scenes can be like. They can be super insular, kind of closed to everything around them. And so the song, I think, works a lot because it just blows the door off of that, right?
Yeah. Did this event, Oka, and this song, and the fact that Oka was on the front page of the newspapers for ages, and then talking to like in your social circle, like with Chris and John and Jord about these events, and then having this song come out and then processing it even more, did this event, this song, like, did this change your perspective on Canada or on the world at all, or on society? Like, what did this do for you, like in the grand scheme of your thought processes about the society around you?
I think, like, when I said my politics changed, it was because of, I read an article that I think was in a Harper's magazine about what Nike workers are paid in Indonesia, or were paid at that time. I had just a pay stub from an Indonesian Nike factory workers pay, and it analyzed some of the numbers on the pay stub, and it was outrageous. It was kind of my first like introduction to like, what, like people work for nothing or pennies, right? And it just kind of blew the doors off my old political view. But I recognized even at the time that even if that was like the thing that caused the flip, that what preceded that were probably 1,000 little things that I couldn't really track or trace. They kind of just added little stones to the scale until that was the last stone and things tipped. But definitely, like, songs like I Want to See Oka Everywhere must have been somewhere in that pile of stones that led up to what for me was that dramatic shift that one day, right? So I wouldn't say that, oh my God, I heard this song and I changed my mind. but was it absolutely somewhere in the like bunch of stuff that I was exposed to that started to cause that shift? It had to have been. Right. And then with my own kind of political awakening, that National Film Board documentary that I mentioned earlier, and some of the reading around it, I'm like, God, this is different. And I still continue to learn. It's not like, oh my God, now I understand. I'm 22 and now I get it. And I recognize also just the milieu I grew up in, and Winnipeg was pretty racist at the time. I didn't grow up in the North End. I grew up in the South End, which was largely not entirely white. And racist stuff would come out of my mouth, including about Indigenous people, about which I was truly ashamed about when I kind of came to awareness. Like, I can't believe I told those jokes. Right. And then gradually over time, I started meeting actual Indigenous people who I had the fortune of teaching at the university at that point, including the Native Access program. So it was basically for Indigenous students who wanted to get into med school and needed some tutoring to do well in the courses that were the feeder courses for med school. And so some of them came from far north, where they came from a town or a little city that was probably less than the population of the university campus. So I was a tutor for a bunch of them and got to sort of be friends with some of them. And they started telling me stuff about their lives too. Like one guy said he just got shoved into the back of a cop car one day, just picked up off the street, and the cops just beat the shit out of him. Like they just beat him in the head and then they just dumped him in a snowbank, like for nothing. Right. And so it's like just the stories and the connection started to really cause that change. Like the concepts were there in the Oka song. But what changes us, I think, is relationships, right? And then I started just getting drawn to it and learning more and feeling more and realizing some of the rage I had when I was a kid, I think about society and about my own family and what I saw in like the dominant culture was, like, I didn't have the words for it. But if I had words, it would be like, what the fuck is this? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what are we doing? Like, this doesn't feel right. And then I encounter some Indigenous people and how they were and some of the things they'd share with me about their culture or their experience or their ceremonies or their teachings. And I go like, wait, that actually makes way more sense. Right? So I honestly believe that Western society is far less sophisticated than it thinks it is. Right? Just because we have cell phones and the internet and these wonderful gadgets and electric cars and, no jetpacks yet, but we're not many. Like there's that Scottish band, they promised us jetpacks. I get that. Right? Or we were promised jetpacks, I think, right?
Yeah.
But like that the social and cultural sophistication of Indigenous cultures, I think, is maybe slowly starting to be recognized. And I'm still learning about it. Just even how do we treat each other? How do we treat the ecology? And if you look at some of the positive changes in dominant society over the last 50 years, by coincidence or not, they're like exactly moving in a direction Indigenous cultures often traditionally have had. So, hey, gay people are actually all right. They're not for killing because they're gay. Well, gosh, most Indigenous cultures I've ever encountered have felt that for years. Hey, don't beat your kids. Kids aren't for beating. Well, that in traditional Indigenous cultures, kids aren't for beating. They're not even for yelling at. Obviously people go offside and there's trauma and stuff. And so it's not like no one's perfect, right? But the traditional belief was you don't yell at children. Oh, guess what? Men and women are actually equal. Well, in traditional Indigenous societies, they were seen as equal, and they are seen as equal and valuable. So it's like this has been like a big thread in my life for the last 30 years, right? And certainly this song is somewhere there at the beginning of just planting that seed of like, things aren't what they appear, right? And they're not what you've been taught or shown, right? So
that is such a wonderful summation about the way that we can continue to learn from all people all over the world and, never realize like we have arrived at, peak society. Like there's always a higher peak to climb for making the world a better place for all people. And, to think that, oh, I have arrived. Everything is great. Everything is perfect. Well, maybe it is for you, but that is leaving out a whole heck of a lot of people in the world who deserve that just as much as you do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And one of my main friends and now teachers is an Indigenous elder from Manitoba. He sort of gets to sort of what you're saying. And he says in such a beautiful way of not knowing and embracing not knowing. Right. And I was listening to your podcast with Chris about the Icaro song and like sort of hearing him sort of feel into this not knowing and this mystery of things, right? Which I think is probably a wise thing to do as we age, right? And so my friend said to me once, he said, I am sure, he said, I do not understand the most important moments of my life.
Mm.
And I went, oh.
Wow. Yeah,
And
that's
it just
powerfully
opens
said.
up this space. You feel it, don't you?
Yeah, I really do. Like right now, I like the hair on my arm is standing up.
Right, me too. Like it opens up this space of like, like why would I presume to know? Like we can attach words. Like if you have kids, I don't know if you do, I don't, but
Yeah.
just like, okay, attach a bunch of words to the love you have for your kid. Right? You could. You're a smart, articulate guy. You could come up with a bunch of words, but is that what it is? I think it can't even approximate it.
Yeah. The
right?
best I've managed to come up with for that is I didn't even come up with this. I heard it somewhere and it just kind of stuck, but it's like having your heart walking around outside your chest. And that's as good as I can do.
Right. Which is powerful and it's metaphoric, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of space between the simile or the metaphor, right? Simile, I guess, technically, right? It like allows our imaginations to go in this nonverbal way. That's probably more important than all the words we can make, right? And so, and I really loved actually listening to that interview that you did with Chris, because it's like, again, I mostly knew him back in the 90s, right? With some contact since then, but not very much. But it seems like, wow, Chris is like, he's cool. Like, he's like a guy I'd want to know now. And hopefully I can get to know him. If not, so be it. Like,
definitely.
But yeah.
Well, and I raked him over. I really raked him over the coals in that interview too. We had a really good time. It was a challenging conversation that I really enjoyed a lot. And the fact that I have it recorded that I can listen to for, the remaining years of my life is really pretty thrilling for me, honestly.
One other thing about Chris, like you asked me in an email, like if I had any insights into the writing process. And I kind of just had this flash appear in my mind of going back to Winnipeg for Christmas, probably to see my parents and my friends, and going up to G7 Welcome Committee Records again on Albert Street. Everything happened there on Albert Street in the same building that the Mondragon Cafe was in.
Nice.
And just sitting there with Chris, like on the steps inside, and just chatting and talking. And I think I had like a demo or something that I recorded. And I said, hey, listen to this. And I'd pop it in and he'd listen to it and he'd like dig it and he'd offer some critiques and he'd like said what he liked. And just that stuff's so valuable. And like the one and only thing that I have as a memory of their writing process wasn't from ever witnessing it. Like I saw some songs that were partially completed when I popped in on a practice of theirs, but not long enough to pick up anything meaningful. But I remember Chris saying to me, like his process is he writes a song and then he imagines his 5 closest friends listening to it and their reactions to it. And if he imagines that they would have a good reaction to it, then it's a keeper. And if he imagines that they wouldn't like it, it's not worth keeping, or it needs to be rewritten or revised. And, for me, that's super powerful. And just to have that creative connection with folks, you can say, hey, listen, I'm working on this. Like, what do you think?
That's real friendship too, because you really need your friends to tell you hard truths about, especially things like creative in nature, like art. That's some of the most valuable feedback you can ever get is whenever somebody deems you safe to be honest with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So I think that's really sound too, right? Because again, especially if the songs we write are kind of an expression of our one song that we carry inside of us, like your friends know you better than anyone. Probably, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a double check on like, wait, is this your song? Like, is this true to you? And if it is,
keeper.
Go for it, right? And if it isn't, maybe switch it up.
Yeah. Well, Conrad, this has been a wonderful conversation. So many fantastic stories. And, I'm just wondering if you wanted to share any links out there or anything, or places where people can find your work that you've been doing over the years. Like, where would you direct people's attention if they want to hear what you've been up to?
Well, my stage name's Riot Nerd, NRRD, and I'm on Bandcamp and I'm on SoundCloud. And I think I put the last album up on with CD Baby, so that's on all the streaming services. That's the Laugh, Cry, Smart, Stupid. So if you're interested at all in my weird brain and the kind of songs that come out of it, then check that out. And it's funny because like the first track on that album is a song called The Dog Riler, which
I
is
listened
about
to it the other day.
my tendency to like to rile up my neighbor's dog. But somehow I managed to slip in lyrics about domestication and Trotskyism and this sort of Taoist concept of sort of being in the eye of the storm, right? And all the while challenging the dog whisperer to fight, basically. So that's kind of how I roll. Like it's Smart Stupid, right? It's such a stupid song, but hopefully I have some of that punk rock spirit alive in it, even though if you're going looking for punk rock in my output, you're not going to find it except for the song Soap is Soap, which is totally punk rock. So you'll at least get your yas out that way if that's what you're really looking for.
Groovy. We'll go find it, folks. Well, Dr. Conrad Sichler, thank you so much for this fabulous conversation.
You're welcome.
And it was just such a pleasure to have you here and to keep me company this afternoon. I really do appreciate it a whole bunch.
You're very welcome. And thanks so much for doing the sleuthing work and finding me and inviting me to be on this. This was a lot of fun, and it made me listen to a lot more Propaganda and also get into more of their recent stuff, which is so interesting. The issues are the same, but like the sort of maturity and subtlety of the connections that Chris has been writing about are, have evolved over time. I think the way that's super compelling still. And of course the music is fabulous, like it always has been, right? So
Hey, Greg and Keith. This is Max Richardson calling in from Boone, North Carolina. I was born and raised in Halifax, Massachusetts. Growing up in that part of that state, I'm 15 minutes from Plymouth Rock, where the Pilgrims landed. You're essentially from birth learning about Native Americans and that kind of colonial historical culture in colonial Massachusetts. But you never really learn about why the wampum people are no longer around or where they went or what happened to them. And I learned about Oka through this song. I'm sure as many people did. I mean, I was born in 1999, so I'm a young buck, but I learned about Oka through this song. And it was shocking to see, I mean, not only that, indigenous people were treated like this, but it was also kind of really just, there's a lot of hope seeing that, people from outside of the Mohawk tribe were also willing to stand up and fight alongside these people and with these people. You can learn a lot about their organizing tactics and what have you through this. So, very thankful that Propaganda, in their early years wrote about something so significant like this. And if it wasn't for this song, I wouldn't have kind of begun to understand, indigenous history and BIPOC history in this country. So thankful for what the band has done and continues to do, and thankful for what you both do and have done. Cheers, guys.
It's about a native kid flipping her wig, just trying to keep some self-respect intact. It's about an Oka the size of a fist in resistance and a will to fight back. The girls at work, they still deny their racism. They claim tolerance for all, but it seems to agree of only racial slurs. They're gay, defining tolerance as hate. There's 27 million girls at work here. Imagine fighting that 500 years. Johnny G, how valiant, how the white oppressor makes them.
All right. Thank you so much to Conrad Sichler and Robbie Richardson for those fantastic conversations. Hilariously, both are doctors. Conrad is a physician and Robbie is an English professor. So they're different kinds of doctors, but it's really, really cool because it just goes to show you that really smart people like propaganda. And I love that so much about this particular band. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I keep thinking I have imposter syndrome with the guests who come onto the show. Like, I'm not equipped to talk about these things.
I love it. Well, we're doing our best here, Keith. And I think that everybody recognizes that, you know, we're putting in as much as we can, but we should get into the song because we've now been jacking around for like 2 hours. And so what do you think? Should we get into the music here real quick?
Yeah. I think that's a good start since we already addressed a lot of history. Well, you know, like normal, Greg, I'll mention some things with the guitar. And first is that opening tone. That guitar tone is a curveball. And I think if you heard an instrumental of this, I doubt that you'd think the lyrical content would be as heavy or involved or as historically well versed as it is, because it just has this lightness in like a non-seriousness to the first chords that are struck. And then, you know, the main riff conveys then the band's anger through speed rather than like real heavy guitar tone or riffage. It has that really melodic break before the vocals kick back in with some fret work that starts to match the strumming hand, which had already been really super fast and blazing. And I like the palm muted accents, which is very 90s punk, right? And I think that happened a lot, but because the band doesn't really do that anymore, hearing them do something so different really stands out. And you know, that riff after Imagine Fighting That for 500 Years is another really standout moment. And just like the riff after And I Support It, those two sections in this song, those compositions really stand out to me in regards to the band's early discography. And they're very unique. I think that the sound and how melodic, but just how they're written and played sounds very different from the other things taking place at this time, guitar-wise, around How to Clean Everything.
Oh, for sure. And you mentioned those accented notes on those palm muted sections of that like musical break between the intro vocals and then where the vocals come back in just over the drums and bass. That is such an influential style of playing in that early 90s. And I mean, like, I think that like Lagwagon was doing it a bit and Propaganda was doing it a lot, but like then you hear that sound come back in so much with later bands like Blink-182 on like Dude Ranch and stuff like that. Like this is such an inspirational style of guitar playing that you mentioned there.
Right.
But like, you know, the opening riff, I wish it had some distortion on it, like the opening strumming on Humane Meat. I wish it didn't have that jangly opening clean guitar tone. And I understand, like, you know, I obviously can't change that and everything, but like I feel like if I had my choice on if the band was redoing this song, that they would change that opening guitar tone from that jangly, like almost like ska clean feel over to more of a distorted feel like they have in the opening for Humane Meat.
Yeah.
But you know, the song also has a really interesting composition. The composition of this song is so weird if you think about it. And it just is like a preview to me of what Propaganda would do to mess with song structure for their entire career. You have the vocals that come in right away. Then there is a huge musical break with no vocals. And then there is a ton of vocals delivered extremely quickly. Then there is a guitar solo with a long break. And then there's more vocals that take it all the way to the end. So it's vocals, huge music break, tons of vocals, music break, vocals, end. So it's a really interesting style of putting a song together. And they've only gotten better at this throughout their career. And I think this is like a nice little preview of the way the Propaganda would mix up the traditional song structure, which makes them so interesting and memorable to so many listeners. But the song has interesting choices in it, which I like. I'm a bit surprised by that super long gap that I mentioned, which takes place from 12 seconds to 39 seconds in the song. And the song is only 2 minutes and 20 seconds long total, but the music fades out at 2:07. So like there's so many lyrics in this song, but there's these huge sections that take place really only in a 2 minute and 7 second song.
Right.
For how much content there is, that nearly 30-second gap from 12 seconds to 39 seconds where they're just riffing and playing super fast is such an interesting choice. And then the song fades out at 2:07 to 2:20. So much happens. But that riff after the intro vocals through that one musical section is so awesome. I know it's a while to make this connection, but like I can't help but thinking about what would happen later in the punk rock world, like with like Dude Ranch and stuff like that, where that was totally that style playing totally comes in through. But you mentioned that song, that part where Chris sings, "I support it," and then it leans into that little bridge guitar solo. I get chills when he says, "I support it," and it goes into that solo. And then it goes into that little weird key change with that
right
at the end there. And so there's a lot of really wild choices on this one, but I really dig that about it.
And then with the bass, Greg, I think it really snaps and it balances out the guitar, which here is kind of trebly, right? It's kind of tinny.
Yeah.
Obviously, they didn't probably have the same opportunity to record as they had with How to Clean Everything. But I really dig the measures without the guitar, where it's just Jord and John K. Samson on the bass. And I think that's just really unique. And, it stands out in their discography as being something that I don't know if I pick up in too many other places.
Yeah, it sure is a rare moment where Chris is just singing over drums and bass on that Song's Not a Romantic Account of History. That is such an interesting point. And you mentioned like the lower fi recording. They did record the 10-inch at a place called God of Thunder in Winnipeg in February of 95, according to the internet. So I don't have a whole lot of information on what the recording setup was like. But the vocal delivery on this one, it's that old style. It's a bit yelly for me in certain points. And it feels like a little less melodically driven than some of their other songs at this time period. And it's got that How to Clean Everything voice, which I know we critiqued a lot in the Showdown episode, which got us in a lot of trouble. But so sorry out there to everybody, but this is like far from being my favorite vocal delivery tune of Chris's. And I say that knowing full well, this is a lot of people's favorite Propaganda song, like of all time. So, I have a little bit of like, I understand the immense importance of this song, but like the vocal delivery just kind of like, I just wish he would have sang it more like he did on Less Talk More Rock, that kind of vocal delivery that we came to know a little bit more about. Because like this was recorded in 95. So like they're recording this basically the same year that they're recording Less Talk More Rock, it seems like. So Chris doesn't sing like this on Less Talk More Rock, but he's still doing it for Oka, which was kind of interesting. But I love it when the band sticks and when bands stick a cappella moments. And so Chris has that standalone line of "Oh, will to fight back," where he's not singing over any instruments, and it just bam, it just hits right in that moment with where there's that musical gap and just vocals, and I love that moment. And Conrad talked about that as well, about how much he loved that moment. So I love that too.
Yeah, it's interesting, Greg. Like I've already connected this more to How to Clean Everything, even though clearly it is closer in timeline to Less Talk. But I think it's just because it sounds so much more like it would be on How to Clean. So he definitely sounds more in terms of his style there. But I think that the anger in his voice is far more palpable. And even if like the style of vocals isn't what I prefer, I really think it fits here more on Oka Everywhere than like other songs where he delivers in the same style that we've already covered, Showdown or Head, Chest, to Foot.
Mhm.
So I actually think it works pretty well. And I like it more than other songs from that era. And then I'll just share a couple of things about the drums. You know, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
They're fast, but they're also complex. There's like that the opening sounds a little bit like a D beat pattern with like occasional cymbal accents. There are abrupt and lightning quick fills. There's a section with just like super heavy toms where the guitar is absent. The cymbal patterns later are memorable, I think, because they're really unexpected and where they come in, like their placement. And I think all of that, especially if you think of the context of what else is happening with punk drums, punk rock drums in 1995, this sounds way different.
Yeah. You know, did you listen to the acoustic version as well?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So the acoustic version, for anyone out there who hasn't heard it, you must hear it. Chris would totally disagree. Chris says he's like, just forget that song even exists, but you can find it on YouTube. You can find it on the Systematic Destruction 7-inch for honestly just a few bucks on Discogs. And like, that's something that I'm having trouble understanding the timeline of when this song came to exist, honestly. Because I'm seeing that the Systematic Destruction 7-inch was out in 94 maybe, and then the 10-inch was maybe recorded and released in 95, but How to Clean Everything came out in 93, but Oka happened in 1990. And so I don't actually know precisely when this was written, when it was recorded. It's one of these like mysteries where there's so much like competing or like lack of filled in information that I'm just kind of having trouble establishing the timeline, because it looks like Systematic Destruction's acoustic version was released in 94.
Sure.
So, I'm not 100% sure if it's closer to How to Clean Everything or if it's closer to Let's Talk More Rock. I just kind of don't know.
Yeah.
But that Systematic Destruction 7 is just super interesting because there's a really long essay by John K. Sampson in the liner notes. And John K. Sampson's name appears in that book. This is an honor song because his publishing company put it out. But Keira Ladner and Leanne Simpson wrote, they said John Sampson of Arbeiter Ring expressed his unwavering support of the project, calling Oka the greatest political education of his life.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So seeing John's essay inside the Systematic Destruction 7-inch and Ladner and Simpson's descriptions of John's dedication to that book project was really powerful. And seeing John's essay next to the Oka acoustic version in the liner notes of that 7-inch is really intriguing. And, John writes about growing up in River Heights, wealthy, suburban, middle class, predominantly white. And he talks about the racist attitudes towards Native people in his school and community. And he talks about the contradiction and the hypocrisy of how they would never say racial slurs against African Americans or Asian people in the community, but somehow it was okay to do so to the First Nations kiddos in the school and in the community. And so there's a really interesting essay in that 7-inch. So if you have it, you should go back and read it because it's pretty interesting. So John and Chris are both like quoted in various places as saying how much this event really opened up their eyes. And, Conrad expressed similar sentiments. And so, it's interesting to hear the jangly sort of like joke version of the acoustic one, because it kind of like, I'm a little concerned that the acoustic version might feel like it downplays the immensity of the subject matter.
I had the same takeaway.
Yeah. Which is why I think Chris probably, isn't really super thrilled on the acoustic version, because it comes off more playful than what the lyrical content expresses,
If I had to guess, Greg, they needed to submit something for a compilation and threw this together. But again, I have no idea. But it is just not very serious. I do think that is
People love it though.
Yeah, right. It makes it for me a little strange after spending so much time with the content and researching for this episode. How different the tone is disconnected from the lyrics, and the guitars are kind of zany. The vocals overall, I think, kind of work how layered they are. And I bet if you threw this on like a folk punk mixtape to someone just getting into that subgenre, they'd probably be pretty into it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like, Early Against Me or AJJ, who changed their name from a different name involving a former president with the initials AJ. But, that makes a lot of sense. But we should get into the lyrics. So we're recording this almost 31 years after these events took place. And in February of 2020, I'm sure you probably read Sean Carlton's article called An Oral History of Propaganda's Oka Everywhere. So Sean Carlton, for anybody who doesn't know, he's a historian of settler colonialism at the University of Manitoba. And he did a retrospective look back at this song in an interview with Chris, which came out in 2020. It was really good. And he wrote, written from the perspective of a settler, the song is an important documentation of non-Indigenous solidarity from the time. The military got involved, and Chris remembered seeing nobody siding with the Indigenous population. So he went and asked his dad, and he said, quote, I remember feeling that something was just wrong about the whole thing. The big turning point was when I asked my dad, a high-ranking military officer, what he thought about the government sending in the military. He surprised me with his answer, actually. He turned red with anger and said that he was, quote, disgusted that the government would deploy the military on its own people. Those were his words. He didn't understand that the Mohawks were not Canadians per se, but I was taken aback by his response. His doubt served to galvanize my own thoughts about what was happening. And I was like, okay, if he thinks this is wrong, if he thinks this is immoral from his very biased perspective, then my private doubts must be right that what I'm seeing really is not great. And the combination of all those things really had an impact on me. So those are Chris's words in conversation with Dr. Sean Carlton at U of M. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So do you have any thoughts on that, or should we dive into the first line of the song?
I just recommend giving that article a read, but yeah, we can get into the first lines.
So this is a very, very vivid opening line. As we've mentioned a couple times, there was an officer on the scene who was killed in the standoff and in the resistance. And the opening line of the song is, the best thing I ever saw on TV was that SQ cop catching a bullet with his teeth. Condolence, Madam Canadiana, but your husband was a fucking stuck pig. And so it talks immediately right off the bat about the police officer's death. And that's a really, really hardcore thing to talk about. And the opening line is somebody dying. And, I have really mixed feelings about this because I don't want anybody to die. And I think that all of this was preventable if the Canadian government had just like kept their word and not sucked for hundreds of years. But of that line, Chris himself even said, I just really regret that first line, minimizing the loss of human life like that. It's too flippant. The guy had a name, which was Corporal Marcel LeMay. I don't even know what he thought about being there. And that part just bugs me. The rest of the song I'll stand behind, but that first line I don't like. The premise all still makes sense to me, pointing out the injustice and hypocrisy of colonial Canada. I just wish I could have another chance at that first line 30 years later. Just being flippant about someone being killed doesn't sit well with me now. It's too much for me now. I mean, I understand where it came from and why I wrote it that way, but there's a part of me that sees a young, callous idiot,
Yeah. And Greg, I was thinking back to Pigs Will Pay in the lyrics, the mantra of a once unfocused mind, but as logic tempered anger, still inspired, but now informed. The pigs we turned the caricature became far worse than we'd warned. And I hear these first lines as the anger overtaking the logic, the lyrics as barbs to clearly identify where the band stands on the issue. Like if Canadians were going to come out in mass to protest the blockades, to hurl rocks at women and children, to burn effigies of Mohawk warriors, celebrating the death of a police officer who was killed, leaves no room for uncertainty.
Right.
It leaves no room for misinterpretation or debate where he stood regarding Indigenous solidarity. So he drew a line, but as that interview with Sean Carlton clarifies, I also think Chris now thinks that he crossed a line in drawing that line. And there's a quote from that same interview. It says, as someone who was starting to question my education and what I thought I knew about Canada and Indigenous settler relations, I was hopeful seeing folks who had little chance of success choosing to resist and take a stand because it was the right thing to do. So at that point, I felt so inspired that I wanted to share that inspiration with everyone. So I attempted in my high school poetry mode of thinking to convey that feeling through music. That's how the song came about, essentially. I was trying to capture my feelings of frustration at the moment as a non-Indigenous settler Canadian.
Yeah. And, it's a really interesting thing to watch people like Chris or other artists reflect on their lifetime of work and critique themselves and change their minds, because I think that changing one's mind is one of the most powerful things that human beings are capable of, but it's one of the things that we do the least because we believe so much in our own ego and our own righteousness. So I love the fact that Chris is openly critiquing his own involvement in this opening line. And if you also think about the fact that the people throwing rocks, giant rocks at cars, at the people who were being, escorted off the reserve, they were clearly okay with hitting somebody in the face with a massive rock. So like the white Canadians who were protesting these blockades, throwing deadly weapons essentially directly at First Nations people who were leaving the reserve, those people were all okay with killing the First Nations people,
Yeah. And Greg, I want to say something really quickly, just since our work as educators, we get to go back and change our lesson plans.
Yep.
We can't like unteach a lesson. If it's the same year, maybe you could address something that you got wrong. But we can always amend things for the future when we learn more, when we change our interpretation of something, when we come into just a greater knowledge of the content. But for musicians, these ideas being now records on the internet, on CD and records and cassette or whatever else, they can't go back and change that. So having to push back on those ideas, I think, is challenging, but it's super important. And they, like musicians and artists, don't have the same opportunity to do so like we do.
Yeah. And this opening line got me thinking about the story of Corporal Marcel LeMay. Mm-hmm. And what I found actually kind of blew me away, right? So Chris acknowledges he doesn't know anything about this guy's life. Mm-hmm. And he was singing about it in what he said was a flippant way. But then I started digging into it, and I found earlier that Marcel LeMay's sister is Francine LeMay, who I mentioned earlier. And after the death of her brother, obviously the family was like devastated, etc., because that's a horrible thing to go through, is the loss of somebody in a family. And Francine read the book At the Wood's Edge, and she began seeking to build some bridges. And in June of 2004, Mavis Etienne, who is a Kanesatake Mohawk who figured prominently during the Oka crisis, was invited to speak at a church in Montreal. And sitting in the congregation was Francine LeMay, Corporal LeMay's sister. And after the presentation, LeMay introduced herself as Marcel LeMay's sister, and Etienne hugged LeMay. LeMay and Etienne then went on a walk, which ended at the Pines, which was the spot of LeMay's death. And afterwards, Tracy Cross, who is Ronald Lasagna Cross's brother, who was a Mohawk warrior at Oka, came up and introduced himself to her, gave her condolences, and then get this, Tracy Cross, Lasagna's brother, then went on to be the best man at Francine LeMay's wedding.
That's wild.
And if anybody like out there who doesn't know this, so Lasagna, Ronald Lasagna Cross, is mentioned in the Rebel Spell song "I Am a Rifle," which Propaganda covered, where he sings "I held Lasagna's hand." So that's this guy from Oka. So we have what's so wild is that Lasagna's brother was the best man at Francine LeMay's wedding, and Francine LeMay's brother Marcel died at the resistance. I mean, the amount of healing that like some involved people go through after tragedies, I mean, is really inspiring, you know?
The micro healing that needs to take place just on a much larger level. I mean, it goes to show that it's possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And you know, this opening line also got me thinking about the media, because it openly discusses the media broadcast. So Chris talks about watching it on TV, right?
Okay.
And the story was constantly broadcast on televisions. And I was so glad that Michael Orsini's essay existed, because he discusses the media, the challenge of being a journalist who tries to interview somebody for a story. And then the question of, well, why should I trust you comes up.
Yeah.
And like, this is a phenomenon of like distrusting the media, which has only worsened since 1990. I bet almost anybody would agree. And if the resistance at Kanasatake happened today, the whole thing would likely be live streamed on Facebook or Instagram Live and would contain far more inner circle visuals and statements. Like, think about how far technology has pushed journalistic coverage since 1990 to today in 2021. And it's really wild to think about how much more accessible it is to broadcast ideas to the world now compared to them. And Orsini writes, quote, "One of the most regretful aspects of these reflections relates to how journalists can become unthinking and unwilling participants in history, not because they are unfeeling or uncaring, but because of journalist culture, or at least the culture that is projected to budding journalists, presents a romanticized view of journalistic craft and rarely pauses to ask journalists to reflect on their own reporting and the impact it might have on others." And you know, Orsini was just a brand new journalist who had to cover one of Canada's most defining Canadian Aboriginal relations issues. And he was a brand new journalist covering this thing that everybody in the country was totally captivated by. So he also talks about how the cops of Montreal became implicated in a shooting of an unarmed black man, Marcellus Francois, that same year. So there was a lot going on between, the military, the police, and the people at that time. And oftentimes they were being covered by journalists who were brand new to the profession.
Greg, I think it's important that you talked about the evolution of the media, especially with, I think of like unicorn riots, filming and screaming of Standing Rock, but also last summer, the Black Lives Matter protests, to where we can cut out the filter or the bias from mainstream media and have visuals and representations directly from like the participants and the people, without someone in a newsroom reading off a teleprompter or getting like lines fed through them through their earpiece. So I'll go ahead and take the next lyric here. It says, "But this song's not about some romantic account of history. It's not about martyrs or mythos or heroes or burnings in effigy. It's about a native kid flipping her lid, just trying to keep some self-respect intact. It's about an Oka the size of a fist and resistance and a will to fight back." And, so often history is reduced to these simple binary explanations like black and white narratives with heroes and villains, with the bulk of the time spent treating history as hagiography, like the founding fathers of any nation,
right,
or elsewhere, to be worshipped and idolized, their lives revered and unquestioned, and their legacy something that we will only fail to recreate and live up to. But like Dr. John Hope Franklin wrote, it is irresponsible not to examine our past with a view to improving the human condition. So lay the details on the table. The repeated history of ignoring land claims, denying sovereignty and rights, abuse, mistreatment, and displacement, and the continued disregard and disrespect, all in the name of a condominium and a golf course.
Yeah.
I also think it's really important here that the band centered a native girl, a young girl in the lyrics, that it says the native kid flipping her lid, because the importance of women at Oka. Senior women, you already mentioned, called clan mothers, continue to appoint men to positions of responsibility in the traditional council. Women went to the front lines when the SWAT arrived at Oka. And then another key of the Haudenosaunee precondition to any negotiations was the free movement of clan mothers between communities and the besieged people at Oka. So a quote I found from Ellen Gabriel, whom you mentioned already. She said, "Our instincts kicked in and we said the women have to go to the front because it's our obligation to do that, to protect the land, to protect our mother." And I remember looking at the faces of the SWAT team, and they were all scared. They were like young babies who had never met something so strong, who had never met a spirit, because we were fighting something without a spirit. There was no thought to it. They were like robots.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about the purpose of a capitalist society, it is more, growth, economic growth. Like the purpose isn't nurturing or humanity. The purpose is build, baby, build. So the polar opposite of the two very different purposes behind these two groups, it couldn't be more different. One seeks to conserve and preserve a time immemorial traditions, and another seeks to steamroll and bulldoze. I mean, that's really like the crux of it. One is destruction and gentrification, and the other is preservation of the natural world. So, I mean, it's really, these are not points of view that can be reconciled. And so, it's wild that there was a burning in effigy that actually happened too. Like that line about the burning in effigy is really important in this song because that actually happened.
Yeah.
But for many of us listening, I mean, you sort of alluded to this, but we probably got romantic accounts of history in our lives. Like I remember the distinct feeling in college of feeling that everything I'd ever learned was a version of a quasi-truth. And just that sheer disappointment of feeling like everyone I'd ever trusted had given me that white supremacist version. Probably that's all they'd been given too. And it makes me so grateful that topics are expanding in scope and viewpoint in classrooms and online and in public. And like the whole like quote unquote cancel culture crowd is just angry because the quote unquote romantic account of history Chris alludes to isn't the sole standard bearer anymore. And they don't know how to reconcile with that because we're moving beyond that. And I love how Conrad, like whenever he read this line, the will to fight back, he just busted into song like mid interview and he couldn't even help but sing it. But that native kid flipping her lid line just reminds me again of the story of Wani Cornmiller, who went on to play water polo for the Canadian Olympic team and whose sister, Teo Horn, went on to play tennis on Letterkenny, who were both at this Oka event, this resistance. And it's just really wild to think of how many stories stemmed out of this. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And so we've got this next lyric. And the girls at work, they still deny their racism. They claim tolerance for all, but it seems the degree of only racial slurs is their gauge, and it defines tolerance as hate. And there's 27 million girls at work here. Imagine fighting that for 500 years. So Conrad mentioned that 27 million was the population of Canada in 1990. I think it's more like 33 million now. But I'm really glad that Conrad talked about the workplace issues in this interview. And my favorite part about Conrad's discussion about the workplace line is that when he talks about how when something like this is going on, whether it's a land reclamation issue or the Gaza occupation or the murder of George Floyd, how talking about it at work and siding with one side or the other how one automatically is likely to enter into an exhausting conversation of having to speak on behalf of many people, which just isn't good for mental health or feeling like people in the world have your back when it comes to an injustice that doesn't concern them. So, like, because an obvious thing that will be said when conversations like this happen is that someone who the conflict's goals doesn't affect is going to say stuff like, quote unquote, law and order and quote unquote, restoring the peace, or just getting back to quote unquote, business as usual. Right. So there's all these like defenses and like counter arguments that are like so predictable, and people who things like land rights issues don't impact seem to be the most defensive of all. And they can't just like understand that, like, you know, you're allowed to side with the people who are being oppressed. Does that make sense? Just because you're not personally oppressed doesn't mean you can't realize, like Chris did, that this is super messed up and I can be on the other side of this.
Yeah, Greg. And I think, you know, overall, I could have maybe jotted down a handful of bullet points regarding Oka before this, you know, a few things that I had read, things I had gleaned from the song. But I think these details, like what I didn't really know about was the response from white Canadians to the blockades and the barricades. And that part is really a really big takeaway for this episode for me. Like the attacks on Indigenous peoples, stopping food from entering the besieged communities, threatening to poison the food. There were French radio stations that were encouraging listeners to confront the Mohawks on the Mercier Bridge. There was the pelting of elders and women and children as they fled, the 10,000 people who marched against the barricades. And I'll be honest, I have no misgivings or naive assumptions about how racist our neighbors can be. I mean, I've come to expect violence and indifference and mistreatment from the government and its agents, but to see quote unquote ordinary people burning effigies and screaming racial slurs, siding with evil, despite just irrefutable evidence that the mayor of Oka and his cronies were willingly carrying on the centuries-long tradition of racist displacement, the steamrolling of Indigenous land rights, and reasonable appeals and peaceful appeals, and policy making that is more about money than democracy. I mean, this is like straight up the plot of an 80s movie that if you saw it now, you would say that it would be too on the nose and too unbelievable in how vile and evil the government was. And, you know, land is an inseparable issue from Oka, but I keep thinking like the schism created by these brazen acts of racism, like what are the long-term consequences of feeling like you are the targeting and the lack of support and the hatred coming from white Canadians and others?
Yeah, it's just total disregard, total disrespect.
And I'd imagine that this line here was probably spawned by real life work encounters with racist coworkers who are unaware of their own hatred and their bigotry and their intolerance, willing to say like one racial epithet, but not others. And for a while, you know, I stopped going to my lunchroom at school when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson because of the racist vitriol coming out of teachers' mouths. Like, I mean, like straight up racist uncle crap. Like, well, if you don't want to get shot, maybe don't break the law. Or I don't remember white people rioting when O.J. Simpson was found out guilty. I mean, teachers saying that. And many of these the same people who jumped on the racial justice train this last summer when it was safer to do so. So people are on board with Black Lives Matter until they block the roads leading to the airports in London or Minneapolis, preventing people from going on their business trips and vacations. And it baffles my mind that one of the most effective parts of Oka was how economically disruptive it was, the blockades of
the bridge,
but also of the trains that you mentioned out west.
Yeah.
How successful that was. And that's what people found to be the tipping point on whether or not they'd support the resistance. So, like Ibram X. Kendi writes, it doesn't matter how you define yourself. If you identify as a racist, if you see yourself as a racist, it's what you say, the things that you believe, the things that you think, and what you do because what you think and believe. That's what determines whether or not you're a racist, not whether or not you say, I am or I am not a racist.
Right. Well, the girls at work still deny their racism is so important because we'll never get anywhere in this world with blanket denials of how we're all brought up with nature and nurture settings and contexts where racism gets instilled into us over many years based on where we live, who lives around us, who doesn't live around us, understanding why people don't live around us, and realizing how that lack of community leads to ingrained racist views that are reversible if one is willing to do hard work on themselves. And we also need to understand opportunity, who receives opportunity, who does not receive opportunity, and understand the intergenerational accumulation of wealth. Who gets that intergenerational accumulation of wealth, who doesn't get it, and understand why those systems exist. And until we can all say, wow, we inherited this overtly racist, de facto white supremacist and male supremacist nation, I didn't choose to be born into this, yet here I am. Now, what can I do about it? Without just defensive blanket denials, we're going to continue to be caught in a loop devoid of healing, where one side cries out for help and the other says, but look at what you already have, and other empty platitudes. You know what I mean? It's like in that movie, American History X, where Edward Norton, the neo-Nazi in that film, talks about like how long ago slavery had been abolished and like blaming plight and struggle on other people, right? It's really wild. But I used to work in the same kind of school system, Keith, where administration attempted to provide professional development with regards to racial equity, implicit bias training, culturally responsive teaching strategies. But there were, white teachers who taught upper level classes, often all white classes in advanced placement levels, who would moan privately to me during these long meetings of, oh, I can't believe we're doing this again, blah, blah, blah. And in hindsight, I'm kind of embarrassed because it meant I wasn't outspoken enough among the faculty to be seen as a person who was pushing the faculty forward to serve all students. Because if this person is sitting there moaning to me about how they don't want to be doing the, the implicit bias training,
right,
that means they think I'm safe to talk to about that. And I'm just like, dang it. And so, I was in my room, at least I did my best in a job where I regularly had in excess of 150 10th through 12th graders a semester. But like if a few racist teachers who cloak their racism and quote unquote objectivity and scoring based on provided curriculum found me to be a sympathetic ear, what does that say about me? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so it's a tough pill to swallow for me. And that's why I'm talking about these things like a little more openly these days.
So the next lyric is, and golly gee, how valiant.
That's what you say. You're a golly gee person all the time.
How the white oppressor makes allowance for calculated gestures of insurgents, all tightly tethered to their purses. Oka had this orchestra aborted. Oka fucked the rules to choose a future self-determined, and I, for one, support it.
Yeah.
And one thing I picked up from the interviews, podcasts, documentaries is how many people in indigenous communities saw this as an awakening, a clear delineation before Oka and after Oka. And even if the findings of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, a need for complete restructuring of relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples in Canada, those findings weren't met and those suggestions were ignored. The land was not ceded by the Canadian government. The only official hearing into the event was the coroner's inquiry into Colonel LeMay's death, but it still meant and still means something greater to those resisting the would-be attempts to violate land claims. And there's this spiral of history circling the drain in Canada and elsewhere in other settler colonial nations, ignoring treaties, disregarding sovereignty, and encroaching on land for corporate wealth or state power, and it reignites conflict every few years. And despite the coverage of and solidarity with these acts of resistance, it doesn't seem like this pattern is going to stop anytime soon. And despite another theme I picked up from everything that I read, which is that generations and generations of indigenous peoples have had to carry on these struggles. Like one of the documentaries, there's literally an elderly woman saying, like, I knew my grandparents had to fight for this land, and I know their grandparents fought for the land, and I never thought really that I would see the fighting as well, and that they would have to fight for these things, like the conflict to maintain independence, humanity, dignity. That conflict is all inherited. It's passed down like a terrible crucible because white people won't open a history book.
Yeah, and to me, this line speaks about to the way that nothing ever gets done about massive structural changes around racism in the US, but also just as much likely in Canada. But, some horror gets dug up, like the Kamloops residential school mass grave. The media does a story like the recent, reporting. Everybody goes, oh gosh, the horror. Survivors are put on television. Then we go back to doing whatever we were doing before, and maybe some money gets paid or whatever. But, the resilience of communities who face real, actual, ingrained challenge inspires me so much. Like, I lead the most comfortable existence ever. And yeah, I shout about it all over the internet and stuff, but I don't suffer or struggle or fight because someone is actively trying to screw me over. I mean, we're all being screwed in many ways by our totally absurd society, which you and I talk about all the time with regards to like healthcare and insurance, like being parents and stuff like that. We're all being screwed. But wow, when a group of people gets underestimated over and over and screwed over for centuries, like we talked about in that timeline with no exception and with no expectation that they'll ever fight back, that's just such a huge mistake to assume that. But honestly, I couldn't even fathom the level of bravery an event like this requires when everybody in an entire country expects you to just give up so the golf course can get built and you don't. Dude, that is so awesome. And like, I just visualize the song sort of like Pigs Will Pay for Chris, where he witnesses a certain amount of things as a person living inside white skin and realizes he's actually on the other side of a conflict that divides human beings or along racial lines. And I see this line as someone demonstrating the ability to change their mind, to realize just how absurd life is for far too many people on earth. And then the lyric, and yes, I recognize the irony, the system I oppose affords me the luxury of biting the hand that feeds, jumps squarely into view. So I see like Pigs Will Pay and Oka leading into, and yes, I recognize the irony. I see this as being like a precursor to the lyrics that Chris would write many years later.
That's a great connection, Greg.
Yeah. And like these examples of these blockades inspired many other actions of land rights resistance, and I learned about the Grassy Narrows First Nation, which started in December of 2002 to protect lands against clear-cut logging. It's received much media attention, but, it's been really inspiring to watch how this event, inspired other actions that people stood up about over the years. And it's just really surreal, the impact this has had. So then there's the last line that we have. If a Kevin Costner and the thing I think I ever said, if a Kevin Costner cavalry is your means to their end, then the struggle is dead. Why do we pretend that our approval is upon what they depend? And this is some clever stuff here, man. It's like a Dances with Wolves reference to Kevin Costner.
Right.
But the way the lyrics are written, Kevin Costner cavalry is written with 3 Ks, so that the acronym KKK, Kevin Costner Cavalry, even though I think Kevin Costner is spelled with a C for Costner.
It is.
But Chris changes the written version of the lyrics to KKK. So it's basically a reference to the white supremacist militia going in to bust some heads based on a de facto white supremacist nation's settler colonial centuries long approaches. to dealing with race relations. And I love the idea of a group of people being badly in charge and everybody just saying, oh, they're in charge. That's that. And then this line asks us to question that, which I love, because it's like, why are we even listening to these yahoos anyway? We should just go about doing what we know is right. And that's what this last line means to me.
It really gives the listener a lot to think about and to chew on.
Yep. So this is the first in a long series of aftermath events. So much has happened since then. In May of 91, Prime Minister Mulrooney announced the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which established to address many issues of Aboriginal status that came to light with the Oka crisis. In 92, Ronald Lasagna Cross and Gordon Lazore were found guilty of 29 of 56 charges against them, were sentenced to 23 months in jail, and Cross was released that April. And, there are many Mohawk individuals who are acquitted of all charges related to the events of 1990, but there were prosecutions. In 96, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People released a report which set out a 20-year agenda to implement real change in the relationship between Canada and the Indigenous population, and urged Canadians to begin a national process of reconciliation. In 2001, there was something called S-24, which was passed by Parliament, which clarified the relationship between Kanesatake and the federal government and makes its relationship with governments comparable to those of reserves. In 2002, there was an agreement signed between the government of Quebec and the Grand Council of the Crees, which was a historic agreement implementation with respect to the recommendation of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples for sharing the revenues derived from mining, hydroelectric development, and forestry carried out in traditional lands of the Cree people. In 2012, 4 women in Saskatchewan offered a series of teach-ins to protest a Canadian bill called C-45, which is an omnibus bill that aimed at changing land management on reserves. And the hashtag Idle No More was created, which we mentioned Idle No More earlier.
Right.
So there's a bunch of outcomes of this. And in July of 2015, on the 25th anniversary of the Kanesatake siege, the new mayor of Oka and the Kanesatake Grand Chief, Serge Simon, vow to never put forth a development plan in the pines that would threaten the peace of the region. And the issue of who holds title to the land is still, however, unresolved. Mm-hmm. And then the 30th anniversary of the resistance passed last summer, and Sean Carlton interviewed Mohawk spokesperson Ellen Gabriel about the aftermath. So Sean writes, with the anniversary of Oka coming up, what do you think has been the legacy of that summer? Was the standoff successful? And Ellen Gabriel writes, I think it was successful for other people, but not for us. Our land issue was not resolved in the end and is still not resolved, but our stand had a number of important ripple effects. The government created the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, which brought to light a lot of the damage from residential schooling and cleared the path for the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015. But our land issue is not resolved. As a result, new development on that land continues, and so does our struggle. So, there's a lot here, man. But a spooky line in the book, This is an Honor Song, appears from Christy Belcourt, who is a Métis painter in Ontario, who said, if another Oka happened tomorrow, I'm sorry to say, but I actually think Canadians' reactions would be worse and less tolerable today than they were in 1990.
Oh, wow.
Which is totally believable, because if you think about the hyper partisan nature of our political systems and the validity given to white supremacists in the United States through the last 5 years of the Trump era, that emboldens bad behavior of other people around the world when they see those types of things happening. So while Canada seems to be like looking on the surface like they're doing better about these things, like I feel like if something like that happened with the emboldened nature of white supremacy in our society today, that they would be in for a lot more complicated of a situation than we might imagine.
Plus, Greg, just mix into that social media misinformation, media manipulation, and the spread of fake news or misleading news stories like that. That would absolutely play a part in any future acts of resistance that might take place.
So, this has been a very challenging episode, very much detail. And I hope that we've done a sufficient job at sort of breaking this down. There's so much more that we could learn, but I found did you find any YouTube comments? I've got a couple.
Yeah. What did you find, Greg?
So I found somebody who said, pretty sure this is my favorite Propaganda song. And another who said, it really is one of their most underrated songs. I wonder why they don't play it live anymore.
Yeah.
Did you find anything good?
I think those are the two that stood out for me as well.
Nice. So I have a teachable moment. I really liked Michael Orsini's conclusion in his essay where he said, to suggest there are lessons learned from Oka would be to trivialize the importance of this event in the public imagination. Oka's lessons cannot be reduced to an executive summary or PowerPoint slide. For those who lived it and through it, it is almost cruel to ask them to imagine a series of lessons or take-home messages. For others, myself included, the Oka crisis remains a focusing event, a reminder, a call to question our own assumptions. Oka's lessons are ours for the taking, if only we have the guts to listen. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, Greg, I do a quote of the week every week in my history class, and one that comes to mind and resonates that I've used before is from Malcolm X. We said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. There are calculated reasons why the genocide of indigenous peoples is brushed over or left out of public school curricula, or why current events related to First Nations are absent almost wholesale from American media or classrooms. And think like what would happen if on a larger scale, people started drawing a line from past events to the present. And if they thought about how language shapes what they think about history and current events. I mean, words like crisis or amnesty or seed, all those words imply something. And in the documentary I mentioned, Kanasatake, the 270 Years of Resistance, Elijah Harper said, the greatest threat to unity and democracy in this country is not the Aboriginal people nor Quebec, but rather the lack of leadership of the government of Canada. And that is absolutely true about the United States as well. And though I'm not really sure anymore if learning from history can help prevent the present, I'd like to still believe that learning from the present can help improve the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and rate this one. Okay.
Let's do it.
So I'm going to give it a 4. It's a very important song, very important lyrics. It's very important that this band was singing about these issues to their largely white audience because, Conrad is a walking testament to being a young guy who grew up with sort of a conservative view, who came to see the breadth and depth of this painful world.
Right.
And had many in real-time epiphanies while actually hanging out with the band. So songs like this are awesome because it just goes to show that this band has been remarkably consistent in their views and their messages throughout the years and who they stand with, what issues they care about. And I think I'm giving this song a 4 more out of respect for the time and place of the song's release and less for the actual song itself. Because I mentioned I have some, thoughts on like the vocal performance and blah, 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 but I don't even want to harp on that because this is like an important song. So while it's not my favorite musical performance the band has ever done, the topic and content is important enough to warrant this one a 4 out of 5 for me.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, Greg. Oka Everywhere is an immensely popular and powerful propaganda song. I mean, I might even say like a cult favorite. Mm-hmm. And I want to think of it almost like in the context of its time, far more so than some of the other earlier songs that we've talked about. And I'm really reminded of what Chris said in his Patreon episode for the Refusing to Be a Man. For that episode, he said he was glad that he put pro-feminist and not feminist on the album cover of Less Talk. Go give that episode a listen if you haven't to hear why. So for me, I think about that because rather than being quick to throw like decolonize around in my teacher bio or my professional emails, before I use those words, I need to dismantle and restructure not only how I think, but also how I teach Indigenous rights, past, present, and future. And this song has made me think just as much, if not more, than any of the 5-star propaganda tracks that we've already talked about. And this has hands down been the most time I've spent preparing and the far most that I've learned. For a 25-year-old song to still be able to do that, warts and all, it must be pretty dang good. So in the context of its time, I'm also going to give it a 4.
Well, thank you so much to all of our listeners out there for checking out this episode. Thank you so much to Robbie Richardson and Conrad Sichler for being guests on this episode. This was a challenging piece of work to put together, and we're very open to learning more. So if anybody has any further ideas or thoughts, feel free to tag us on like Twitter and stuff like that, and we can blast out more resources into the world for people who want to know more. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at PropagandyPod. You can shoot us an email at propagandapod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
If a Kevin Costner cavalries your means to their end, then the struggle is dead. Why do we pretend approval is upon what they depend?
This song's a new one. It's called I'd Like to See Oka Everywhere. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what Oka was. It's something that happened 4 years ago in Canada where Mohawk people had finally taken enough of being stepped on by the Canadian government and stood up to them. And if they didn't win the situation, they wanted international attention for their cause. And this is about Native resistance to white oppression. And we support it by any means necessary because it's been 500 years and it's just of genocide and bullshit. I don't know what it's like here, but where we're from, it's just fucking terrible. It's apartheid.
The best thing I saw on TV was that SQ come catching a blood with a steam. Just all it's not a Canadian and with a husband was a fucking fight back. Fuck the rules, don't choose, don't